That night is burned into my memory in a way I wish I could erase. We had just gotten married that morning, and Nathan had taken me to this beautiful, expensive restaurant in downtown Chicago for what was supposed to be our first romantic dinner as husband and wife. I remember the tablecloths were so white they almost glowed under the soft lights, and the air smelled of roasted garlic and red wine. I felt like a character in one of those glossy magazines, only this was my life now. Or so I thought. Nathan picked the wine himself, told me it was special, and I trusted him the way a woman trusts the man she just vowed to spend forever with. I had stepped away for a minute to take a call. My mom was buzzing my phone nonstop, and when I sat back down, the waiter leaned close to me. I can still hear his whisper in my ear, "Please, don't drink from the left glass." Just like that. My stomach dropped, but I forced a smile, pretended nothing was wrong, and slowly, casually, I switched the glasses. My hands were shaking so badly, I thought the stem would snap between my fingers. Nathan looked at me with that easy smile of his, the kind that used to melt me. He lifted the glass that was meant for me, the one on the left, and he drank it while locking eyes with me. I tried to smile back, but my face just wouldn't obey. And inside I was screaming, "What is happening? Why would that waiter warn me?" I scanned the room, desperate to find him, but he had vanished. My phone buzzed again. It was my mom, the third time that night. But I couldn't answer. How was I supposed to tell her about my perfect wedding day when I suddenly felt like the ground was slipping out from under me? I turned the phone face down on the table and listened to Nathan talk about our flight the next morning, about how excited he was for our honeymoon. His lips were moving, but I wasn't hearing any of it. My eyes were glued to that glass. He kept drinking, one sip then another, and all the while I couldn't touch mine. My chest was so tight, I thought everyone in that restaurant must hear my heart pounding. My thoughts went spinning back to all the warnings I had brushed aside, my mom crying and begging me to wait, my girlfriends whispering that it was all happening too fast, that 6 months wasn't long enough to truly know a man. But I was so sure that Nathan was the love of my life. And there I was, watching him sweat through his collar, loosening his tie, dabbing his forehead with a napkin, insisting it was just a little warm in there. And I sat frozen, paralyzed, torn between denial and the dawning terror that maybe, just maybe, the man I had married that morning was not the man I thought he was. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure the entire restaurant could hear it. I couldn't breathe, couldn't blink, couldn't do anything but stare as Nathan's face drained of color. His hand trembled, the fork slipped from his fingers and clattered against the plate, sharp and metallic, like a warning bell echoing in my ears. He tried to smile at me, God, he really did, but the corners of his mouth twisted into something crooked, almost grotesque. His eyes looked strange, his pupils blown wide, and he muttered, "I don't feel so good." That voice, low, shaky, felt like someone else's, not the man I had just promised forever to that very morning. I should have screamed, should have called for help, should have reached for my phone. But I just sat there, rooted to the chair, disbelief swallowing me whole. Not tonight, not on our wedding night, not him. When he pushed back his chair, trying to stand, his legs gave out beneath him. The glass tipped, scarlet wine spilling across the pristine white tablecloth in a stain that looked too much like blood. The sight jolted me upright, but instead of rushing toward him, I flinched back, as though he carried some kind of contagion. A couple at the next table gasped, chairs scraped against the floor, and in seconds the entire room shifted its gaze onto us. The waiters came rushing, their crisp uniforms blurring together as they tried to catch him, to keep order. And me? I stood frozen, watching my brand new husband collapse onto the polished floor, his face twisting with pain and something else. Not fear, not confusion. No, in his eyes there was fury. A raw, piercing fury directed straight at me. And then, out of nowhere, I noticed him, the same young waiter who had warned me. He appeared at my side, close enough for me to feel the tension rolling off him. He crouched near Nathan, pretending to help, but his glance darted quickly to the half-empty glass on the table. His jaw tightened. He didn't meet my eyes, but I felt it, the weight of his presence, as though he knew more than he could ever admit aloud. Around us, the restaurant turned into chaos, voices overlapping, someone shouting for 911, others fumbling for their phones. Chairs toppled, heels clicked against the marble, and through it all, I just stood there, like a ghost at my own wedding dinner, watching my life unravel in a single unbearable moment. People shouted over one another, the sharp command to call 911 rising above the noise as a few strangers tried to keep Nathan upright, fanning him, shaking his shoulders, urging him to stay awake. The restaurant had dissolved into chaos, forks clattering onto china, chairs scraping across the marble floor, voices breaking into panic. And through it all, I stood just outside the circle, as if a ghost had slipped into my place, watching my own wedding night collapse into something unrecognizable. My gown clung to me, heavy and suffocating, and I felt absurd, like a woman dressed for a fairy tale who had been dropped into a nightmare she couldn't wake from. When Nathan's eyes fluttered open, I braced myself for confusion or fear, but what I met instead froze me more than anything else could have. His stare was sharp, wild, and filled not with pain, but with fury so naked it scorched through me. In that instant, I understood he knew I had switched the glasses, and he believed the poison, whatever it was, had been meant for him by my hand. The realization hollowed me out, my breath caught, and my body screamed to move, to scream back, to defend myself. Yet I couldn't manage a sound. The restaurant manager rushed in, his polished shoes sliding slightly on the slick floor as he crouched beside Nathan. His voice was clipped with urgency, demanding answers, leaning down to catch whatever Nathan was muttering. I couldn't make out the words, only saw Nathan's lips move and his shaking hand rise, his finger pointing straight at me with a clarity sharper than any accusation spoken aloud. The manager turned his gaze on me then, suspicion etched into his furrowed brow, and though he started asking me questions, the words came through as if underwater, muffled and distorted, impossible to grasp. I staggered back a step, then another, every instinct warning me I was no longer just a bystander, but already cast as the villain in this unfolding tragedy. The crowd pressed tighter around Nathan, strangers' bodies forming a wall between me and the man I had married that very morning. No one looked at me, no one asked if I was all right, no one even remembered I was his wife, except for one figure standing slightly apart. The young waiter, Tyler, his face drawn tight, his jaw clenched, finally raised his eyes to meet mine. He didn't speak, didn't move, but the message was there, silent and certain, carried in the intensity of his gaze. Run. And so I did. Not in a frantic sprint that would draw more attention, but with measured steps, my back straight, my breath shallow, as I turned and walked toward the doors, knowing I was leaving not just that restaurant behind, but the life I thought I had stepped into only hours earlier. I didn't run, because running would have screamed guilt. It would have drawn every eye to me, and I couldn't let that happen. Instead, I forced myself into measured steps, my lungs fighting to stay, even as if I could trick the world into believing I was calm. At the coat check, I retrieved my purse and a light jacket, and the young woman behind the counter gave me the kind of pleasant, automatic smile people give strangers at the end of their shift. I returned it, but it felt like my lips were carved from stone, a reflex without life, as though my body had detached from me and was just going through the motions. When the doors swung open and I stepped onto the sidewalk, the chill of the Chicago night slapped my face. The city was alive, horns blaring, snippets of conversations, the bass of a song thumping from a nearby bar. All of it clashed violently with the truth I carried inside, that my world had just shattered in that candlelit dining room. People brushed past me, laughing, arguing, carrying takeout bags, and not one of them had any idea that only a block away, a man was writhing on the floor and silently damning his bride. I stood there for a long moment, unsure where to go. I couldn't go home. That would be the first place they would look for me. I couldn't face my mother, not yet. Not with words like, "My husband tried to poison me on our wedding night," stuck in my throat. What would I even say? Sorry, Mom, you were right all along. I pulled out my phone, the screen glowing with dozens of missed calls, text messages stacked on top of one another, friends, co-workers, and especially Mom. They all wanted to hear about the magical day, to share in my joy, and yet there was no joy left in me to give. With a trembling finger, I shut the phone off and let the silence fill the void. A cab passed, its green light flicking in the dark, and I lifted my hand before I could change my mind. Sliding into the back seat, the vinyl cold against my bare legs, I gave the driver the only address I could think of, a small, run-down motel on the city's edge where I'd once stayed with an old friend. The driver chatted easily about the weather, about the traffic, even offered a compliment about how radiant I looked. I murmured something back, my voice thin, hoping he couldn't see the cracks in me, hoping he didn't notice the way my wedding dress under the jacket seemed suddenly more like a disguise than a dream. I kept my answers clipped and short, praying the driver wouldn't notice how tightly I was clutching my purse, how I kept smoothing the front of my jacket to hide the satin beneath. I prayed he wouldn't realize I was still in a wedding gown, with no suitcase, no overnight bag, just a trembling bride alone in the back seat of his cab. It struck me then, with the kind of cold clarity that makes your stomach turn, that I had almost nothing with me. Just a few crumpled bills, a credit card, and my phone. No clothes, no ID, no passport. Everything I might need to prove who I was, or to survive more than a night, was sitting in the apartment Nathan and I were supposed to return to after dinner. My chest felt too tight, each heartbeat hammering as if it were trying to break free from my ribs. I cracked the window and let the night air slap my face, greedy for the sting of it, desperate to feel anything other than panic. The driver's eyes flicked to me in the rearview mirror, his brows pinching with concern, but he didn't say a word. I could see the question sitting on his tongue. Are you okay? But he swallowed it, maybe sensing that whatever I carried was more than a stranger in his cab should touch. We rolled past streets that glowed with neon and laughter, past couples spilling out of bars, past groups of friends waving down rides, and the cruelest part was how normal it all looked. Just hours earlier, I had been part of that normal life, standing in front of the mirror in a gown that felt like magic, my mother dabbing at her eyes as she pinned my veil, my friends fussing over curls and lipstick, chattering about how lucky I was. Back then, every smile felt like a promise. Every detail seemed to whisper that my future was beginning. Now the memory felt like it belonged to someone else, some other woman who had believed in happy endings. By the time the cab pulled up to the motel, my body felt hollow, running on instinct alone. I shoved a wad of bills at the driver, more than the fare, hoping the extra would buy me silence instead of questions. He nodded, muttered thanks, and I stepped out into the dim light of the parking lot, the gravel crunching under my heels. The air smelled faintly of fried food from a nearby diner, the kind of ordinary scent that should have been comforting, but only reminded me how far I had fallen from the fantasy I thought I was living. With my purse clutched tight, I walked toward the tired-looking building, each step pulling me further away from the girl who had believed that marrying Nathan was the start of her forever. The motel looked exactly as I remembered it, maybe even sadder in the harsh glow of its neon sign. A squat, 3-story building with peeling paint and a parking lot that smelled faintly of gasoline. It wasn't the kind of place anyone chose for romance or comfort, which was exactly why I had come. I needed to disappear, to blend into the quiet anonymity of a place that didn't ask questions. The lobby was dim, the air heavy with stale coffee and disinfectant, and behind the counter sat an older woman with tired eyes who gave me the kind of once-over that made my skin prickle. Her gaze lingered on the jacket hiding the wedding dress, on my lack of luggage, on the way my hair was falling from the pins. I mumbled something about surprising my husband, about how he'd be joining me later, and even to my own ears it sounded flimsy. She didn't believe a word, I could tell, but she didn't press. She slid my credit card through the machine, handed me a plastic keycard, and went back to her paperwork, as if she had seen stranger stories walk through her doors. I clutched the key, climbed the stairs to the second floor, and felt every creak of the carpeted hallway under my shoes like it was shouting my presence. The room was as unremarkable as I needed it to be. A double bed with a faded spread, a nightstand with a lamp that buzzed faintly, a television older than I was, and a bathroom that smelled of bleach. I locked the door, slid the metal latch across, and only then let the air out of my lungs. My knees buckled, and I sank against the wall, sliding down until I was curled on the thin carpet. The trembling wouldn't stop. It wasn't from the cold. The heater rattled and hissed in the corner, but from the weight of what had just happened. My husband, the man I had promised my life to that very morning, had tried to poison me before the night was even over. I don't know how long I stayed like that, knees pulled tight to my chest, rocking slightly as if that motion alone could keep me sane. Minutes bled into hours, reality blurred and smeared like watercolor in the rain. At some point, the sound of a television in the next room broke through, a laugh track clashing cruelly against my spiraling thoughts. Forcing myself upright, pins and needles shooting through my legs, I stumbled toward the mirror over the dresser, and when I finally lifted my eyes to it, the woman staring back was not a bride, not even someone I recognized, but a pale stranger with smudged makeup, wild eyes, and the look of someone who had just learned she had married a man who wanted her gone. The woman staring back at me from the mirror wasn't me, not the me I had believed in that morning. Her face was ghostly pale, her eyes wide and rimmed in red, mascara streaked across her cheeks like bruises. Her hair had come loose in wild strands, sticking damply to her skin, and the gown, oh God, the gown, looked absurd now, hanging from her body like a costume from a cruel joke. Hours earlier, it had been a dream, a symbol of love and new beginnings, but under the yellow light of that motel room it seemed grotesque, like evidence of how blind I had been. I stripped it off and let it crumple onto the carpet in a heap, no more precious than a discarded curtain, and stepped into the shower. The water pounded over me, scalding hot, washing away foundation, hairspray, perfume, the trappings of a bride who no longer existed. I pressed my forehead to the cool tile and let the steam burn my throat, but nothing, not even the force of the water, could rinse away the terror curling in my gut. I wanted to believe I could wash off the whole day, scrub it from my skin, but when I stepped out, wrapped in a stiff motel towel, the fear clung to me like a second skin. Sitting on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning under my weight, I stared at the darkened screen of my phone until my own reflection blinked back. What now? Where could I go? Who would I even call? With a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, I powered it on. The screen erupted with life, dozens of missed calls, texts stacked into unread towers, emails piling one after another. I didn't open any of them. Instead, with trembling hands, I pulled up the browser and typed the name of the restaurant and the word incident. Nothing. Too soon, maybe. Or maybe there was no story because nothing had happened. Maybe I had misread everything. But the whisper of the waiter replayed in my head like a looped recording. Please don't drink from the left glass. I knew then that he had seen something, seen Nathan's hand drop something into my wine, seen enough to risk warning me, even if he disappeared after. Clutching the towel tighter, my fingers slick with sweat, I tapped the restaurant's number into my phone. After a few hollow rings, a man's voice finally answered. My throat tightened, and before I could think better of it, I heard myself asking about my husband, desperate to know if Nathan was alive, and terrified of what I'd hear if he was. I told the man on the phone that Nathan and I had argued, that I'd stormed out, and now I was worried about him. There was a long pause, the kind that makes your skin crawl, before he answered in a clipped professional tone that the ambulance had taken a guest to the hospital, and that was all he knew. His words were final, the way people speak when they've already said too much. I thanked him, hung up, and sat motionless with the phone heavy in my hand. Nathan was alive, or at least he had been when the paramedics wheeled him away. My stomach twisted at the thought of what he might have told them, what lies he might already have planted in the ears of the doctors, the police, anyone who would listen. I turned to my purse, dumping its contents onto the thin motel bedspread. A lipstick, a compact, a comb, a wallet with some cash and cards. my old apartment keys, the small collection of things I had carried without thought. And then something I hadn't expected slid into view: Nathan's leather satchel. My breath caught. I didn't even remember grabbing it. Maybe it had been reflex in the chaos, my hand reaching for what was familiar when everything else was breaking apart. For a moment I just stared, heart thudding, before I forced myself to unzip it. Inside were the ordinary markers of his life: a wallet, a ring of keys, a stack of documents I didn't yet dare to touch, and his phone. I froze. The black screen stared back at me like an eye, and I told myself not to, that I had no right, that nothing good could come of it. But I already knew the code. Nathan had shown me once, laughing, when he'd asked me to read him a message while he drove. The date of the night we met. My hands shook as I tapped it in, and just like that, the phone opened itself to me. I scrolled through with the cautiousness of someone expecting to find a landmine. Texts, emails, call logs, all bland, all polished, the kind of digital life that would pass for spotless if anyone else saw it. His conversations with me were there too, sweet words and emojis, the very ones that had once made me feel cherished. I told myself I should stop, that I had no energy left to peel away another layer of lies, but my thumb kept moving until it landed on the gallery. And there we were, Nathan and me, hours earlier, smiling into cameras, his arm looped snug around my waist. His grin seemed effortless, the picture of a proud groom, and I felt a chill ripple through me at how convincingly he had played the role. In the photos, I looked like the version of myself I thought was real, laughing, gazing up at Nathan with eyes that believed every word he said. There we were, cutting the cake, smiling as if sugar and icing could seal a forever. There we were, moving through our first dance, my cheek pressed to his chest, my dress swaying as though it was floating on the air. Happy, in love. At least that's how it seemed on the surface. But scrolling through, each picture began to feel like a still from a play, and I was realizing I had been cast in a role without knowing it. I swiped further, seeing snapshots from the months we'd spent together. The beach trip where he held my hand and kissed my hair. A dinner where the wine glowed amber in the glasses between us. A walk through the park on a late summer afternoon, leaves golden around us. All of it looked so normal, so painfully ordinary, the kinds of images couples post online to prove their lives are full. Only now, sitting alone in that motel, those images stabbed at me because I knew what I hadn't known then, that the smile on his face wasn't devotion, it was calculation. And then I hit the photo that froze the air in my lungs. Nathan, dressed sharp, standing in some office with a man in a dark suit. They were shaking hands across a polished desk, papers spread between them. My fingers pinched the screen, pulling the photo closer, heart pounding in my ears. At first, it looked like just another business meeting, but then I saw it. The words printed across the page. A life insurance policy. My name typed neatly into the form. I stared until the letters blurred, but there was no mistaking what it said. Claire Allen, the insured. And beneath it, the beneficiary, Nathan Carter. The number mocked me, bold and obscene, $5 million. My knees buckled and I grabbed the edge of the bed, certain the room was tilting. My chest tightened, my breath came shallow, and every instinct in me screamed that it couldn't be true, that there had to be some other explanation. But the evidence was there in my hands, undeniable, and the woman in the wedding photos, the smiling bride, the willing believer, suddenly felt like a stranger I wanted to warn, a stranger I wanted to save. I tried to reason with myself, desperate for a version of events that didn't shatter everything I believed. Maybe it was a standard policy, something thoughtful. Maybe Nathan had wanted to surprise me, to make me feel secure about our future together. I clung to that explanation for a fleeting moment, but then the whisper of the waiter slid back into my mind, sharp and cold. Please, don't drink from the left glass. The words refused to loosen their grip, and so I kept searching, scrolling through his phone as though the truth itself was buried somewhere inside. His inbox was full of the ordinary clutter of a man with a high position at a construction company, contracts, schedules, project updates, the kind of business that carried no hint of malice. For a moment, I almost let myself exhale until I opened his sent folder. There, among the routine exchanges, was an email from just a week ago. No greeting, no details, just a phone number and a single line. Call when it's ready. My skin prickled as I copied the number and searched his contacts, finding it filed away under a single letter, K. No name, no context, no explanation. I opened his call log, and my stomach dropped when I saw it. The last call to that number had been placed earlier that very morning, just hours before our wedding. It lasted less than a minute, but my pulse began to thunder, as if every beat were trying to force me to see what I didn't want to admit. My fingers shook as I closed the log, the edges of the phone slippery with sweat. I wanted to push it all away, to deny what was staring at me, but the pieces were already arranging themselves into a picture that made me sick. Against my better judgment, I checked the browser history. Most of it had been wiped clean, but a few entries remained, like rotten scraps left behind. Undetectable poisons, symptoms of poisoning, statute of limitations on murder. The room pitched around me, walls bending in and out of focus, and a wave of nausea climbed my throat so violently I could barely breathe. With a strangled gasp, I tossed the phone onto the bed as if it had burned me, and stumbled to the bathroom, one hand pressed against my mouth, the other groping along the wall, desperate to keep myself from collapsing under the weight of what I had just uncovered. The sickness came in violent waves, leaving me crumpled on the cold tile, arms wrapped around the porcelain like it was the only thing anchoring me to the world. My body shook with sobs that tore through me until I felt hollow, raw, and empty. I kept whispering to myself that it couldn't be true, that no one marries a woman in the morning and plots her death by evening, but the evidence screamed otherwise. Nathan had insured my life for a fortune and had tried to poison me hours after signing our vows. The truth was merciless, and no matter how much I wanted to deny it, I couldn't unsee it. When the tremors finally eased enough for me to move, I crawled back into the dim motel room and reached for his phone again. As much as it terrified me, I needed more proof, more context, anything that might explain what I was caught in. My fingers ached as I scrolled through the gallery once more, forcing myself to look closely, to search for details I had skimmed past before. And then I found them, images that didn't belong in the life of a faithful husband. Photo after photo of Melissa, my closest friend since college, appeared in the feed. Not selfies we'd taken together, not party shots or group dinners, but candid, distant pictures, clearly taken without her knowledge. Melissa stepping out of her apartment building, Melissa slipping into her car, Melissa at a cafe sipping from a paper cup. The sight of them iced my veins. Why was he watching her? Why would he keep these hidden among photos of me? I dug into their message history, my breath hitching as the screen filled with lines of text. On the surface, it looked ordinary. Banter about birthday gifts for me, casual questions about my favorite flowers or wine, the kind of conversations friends might have if they were planning a surprise. But beneath the surface, something was off. Gaps, whole stretches of time where responses were missing, holes where replies should have been, deleted messages. The silence in those empty spaces was louder than anything written, and it made my stomach lurch. The gaps in their messages gnawed at me, the way the timeline didn't add up, whole conversations missing as if they'd been scrubbed clean. I turned to his banking apps, most of them locked behind extra passwords I couldn't crack, but one opened easily, and what I saw inside made my skin crawl. Regular transfers, large ones, going to an account labeled with two simple letters, MC Melissa Collins. My best friend, the woman who had held my hand through heartbreaks and who had toasted me at the wedding reception only hours earlier. The most recent transfer had gone through just yesterday, and the amount made me gasp. $200,000. The memo line claimed it was for a consultation, but I knew Melissa wasn't in consulting, unless betraying me behind my back counted as a service. My throat closed, the betrayal so sharp it almost felt physical. Melissa, my Melissa, the girl who had known all my secrets since college, who had cried with me, laughed with me. She was in this with Nathan? I stared at the glowing screen, begging it to rearrange the facts into something less damning, but the truth sat there, stubborn and undeniable. The phone suddenly buzzed in my hand, jolting me so hard I nearly dropped it. An incoming call. The name flashing across the screen made my stomach twist. Brandon, Nathan's brother. I barely knew him. He lived out of state and had only come for the wedding. A tall man with a cold smile I had never trusted. I let it ring out and disappear, but within seconds the phone lit up again with his name. Panic surged. I rejected the call, my thumbs slick with sweat. Moments later, the vibration returned, but this time it was a message. My eyes scanned the words, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Nathan is in the hospital. Where are you? The police are looking for you. Just like that, the ground shifted beneath me. Of course Nathan had turned it around. Of course he had painted me as the monster, the wife who tried to poison her husband. I dropped the phone onto the bed, my pulse hammering, my mind spiraling. The trap wasn't just personal anymore. It was public, and the law itself was coming for me. He had turned me into the villain, painted me as a criminal before I even had a chance to breathe. I shut off his phone and tossed it onto the bed like it was poison itself, then forced myself to power on my own. The screen exploded with notifications, missed calls, unread messages, desperate pings stacking one on top of another. My mother, my co-workers, old friends, and Melissa. Of course, Melissa. Her text glowed on the screen, time-stamped just half an hour earlier. Claire, what's happening? Brandon called me and said you tried to poison Nathan. This is insane. Please call me. My lips curled at the words. She was playing innocent, acting clueless, but I had already seen the bank transfers, the hidden photos. She was no bystander, she was in it with him, and now she wanted to drag me into her performance. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I pulled up the local news, my thumb heavy with dread. The incidents section carried a short, sterile notice. A man was hospitalized from a downtown restaurant with suspected poisoning. No names, no details, just a vague line that reduced my unraveling life to a blurb between traffic accidents and weather alerts. But I knew. Every word of it was about Nathan, about me, about the marriage that had lasted less than a day before turning into a nightmare. Reading it made me feel both exposed and erased at the same time, as though the world knew enough to watch but not enough to understand. My mind spun with impossible questions. Where could I go now? Home was out of the question. They'd be waiting there. My parents' house? No, I couldn't drag them into this, couldn't bear the look in my mother's eyes if the police knocked on her door. Friends were off limits, too. Melissa had proved how easily trust could rot, and even the thought of calling anyone else felt like stepping into a trap. Every safe place I had ever known suddenly felt compromised, already tainted by suspicion. I stared at the few possessions I had, a handful of cash, a credit card that would likely be frozen by morning, and a phone that could betray my location with every passing second. My pulse thundered in my ears as the reality sank in. I wasn't just hiding from Nathan anymore. I was hiding from the police, from the city itself, from a story already being written without my side. The walls of the motel seemed to press in on me, the buzzing lamp above casting a spotlight on my panic. And I realized I had only one choice left: disappear before they came knocking. The dress mocked me, spread across the bed like a relic of some other woman's life. There was no way I could step outside in it without drawing stares, whispers, questions I wasn't ready to answer. My eyes darted around the room until they landed on the closet, where a thin motel robe hung limply from a hook. It wasn't much, but it could cover me long enough to slip into the night and find a 24-hour store for something less conspicuous. The thought of wandering into a fluorescent-lit aisle, pretending to be normal while my world collapsed, made my stomach twist. Even if I managed to buy clothes, where would I go then? Leave Chicago? Leave the country? With no passport? No plan? No one I could trust? The idea of turning myself in flickered for a moment, but I shoved it away. What did I have? One terrified waiter's whisper against the word of a polished, successful man writhing dramatically on a restaurant floor. The truth was, no one would believe me. They would look at Nathan with his charm and business ties, and then at me, the panicked bride who had fled the scene, and they would decide instantly who was guilty. My pulse thudded with the certainty of it as I grabbed his phone again, my fingers trembling with both fear and determination. There had to be something here, something undeniable, something that could prove this wasn't hysteria, that I wasn't imagining the darkness behind his smile. I dug through his notes, his calendar, even the dusty corners of his settings, but it was all maddeningly ordinary. Then a memory surfaced. Something he had mentioned offhand once about keeping his most important files locked away. My hands felt clumsy as I pulled up the file manager and toggled the hidden folders. And there it was, a small icon that carried more menace than anything else I had seen that night. A password-protected folder. My breath caught. I tried the code he'd given me before, the date we met, but the screen blinked red, rejecting it. My heart sank. I tried again with today's date, our wedding day, as if some twisted sentiment might have guided him. Another rejection. I sat there, the glow of the screen painting my face, the silence in the room pressing down like a weight. And then I remembered. The one date he never forgot. The one he repeated so often, it had etched itself into my memory. The day his mother died. My fingers hesitated over the numbers, my throat tightening, before I pressed them in slowly, one by one. The phone thought for a moment, a small spinning circle on the screen, and then the folder unlocked with a quiet click. My chest tightened as I realized I had just pried open the place where Nathan hid his real life. He used to say that date had changed him forever, that it was the day he became who he really was. My stomach turned as the screen unlocked and the folder opened like a vault I should never have touched. At first, my eyes didn't understand what I was looking at, but then the shapes came into focus. Photographs, lined up in neat digital rows. Dozens of women, their faces staring back at me, some smiling, some caught in candid moments. My breath hitched when I recognized a few. Women Nathan had introduced at the wedding as old colleagues or friends from business. Others were strangers, their faces unfamiliar yet haunting, as if they carried a warning I was only now able to hear. I swiped further, my throat tightening with each new file, until I stumbled on the documents. Insurance policies stacked like receipts, their cold typeface announcing the same grim pattern. Marriage certificates, crisp and official. And then the gut punch. Death certificates, tucked alongside them like a macabre ledger of a life built on tragedy. My fingers hovered above the screen, trembling, as the truth unfolded in a rhythm so grotesque I thought I might faint. Nathan had been married before, not once as he had casually confessed over dinner months ago, painting himself as a man scarred by loss. Not even twice, which might have been enough to elicit sympathy. No, 3 times. 3 wives, 3 lives, all cut short by accidents that now screamed of design. A car crash, a balcony fall, a honeymoon drowning, and in each case his name appeared again and again as the grieving husband, the bereaved widower, the man the world consoled, while quietly wiring him the payout from yet another policy. The phone felt slippery in my hands as bile rose in my throat. He had done this before, methodically, flawlessly, each death wrapped in the disguise of misfortune, and now I understood with bone-deep certainty what I had nearly become. I was supposed to be the 4th, the next tragic story whispered at funerals, the next sympathetic headline, the next check cashed in his name. My entire body shook as the motel room seemed to tilt and narrow, and the only thing louder than my pulse was the realization that my life had been minutes away from ending the same way as theirs. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at those files, the faces of women who were no longer alive, their tragedies archived like trophies. Time had lost all meaning, minutes, hours, it didn't matter anymore, until a sudden knock shattered the haze and dragged me back into the present. The sound was sharp, deliberate, and it rattled through my bones. My hands jerked, the phone slipping from my grasp onto the thin motel carpet. "Who is it?" I managed, trying to steady my voice, though it cracked on the edges. "Police," came the reply, a firm male voice on the other side of the door. "Open up, please." My heart stuttered, then raced so violently I thought it might give me away. How had they found me so quickly? The phone. Of course, the phone. My throat tightened as I answered, stalling for time. "Just a minute." My mind spun wildly, desperate for options. I grabbed Nathan's phone, shoved it into my pocket along with my own, and swept my few belongings into the motel robe. The pounding came again, harder this time, rattling the flimsy frame. "Mrs. Carter, we know you're in there. Open the door." The use of his name instead of mine cut through me like a blade. My gaze snapped to the window. Second floor, not too high. I darted across the small room, yanked it open, and was hit with the rush of cool night air. Below, a narrow awning jutted out over the motel's entrance, with a patch of shrubbery just beyond. Behind me, voices barked instructions, and I heard the scrape of something against the lock. They were preparing to force their way in. My pulse hammered in my ears as I climbed onto the sill, the robe flapping against my legs, my breath shallow and ragged. The door shuttered under a heavy blow just as I swung my legs out into the night. I didn't allow myself a second thought. I pushed off, the air rushing past as the world tilted, then slammed down hard on the metal awning. Pain shot through my ankle, white-hot and searing, but I bit it back, teeth clenched against the cry that threatened to escape. The awning groaned beneath me, tilting as I scrambled forward, sliding toward its edge. With one last burst of strength, I let myself drop onto the bushes below. The branches scraped my skin, but they broke the fall, and then I was on the ground, gasping, alive, with the motel lights glaring above me like a spotlight I had to escape. The bushes caught me just enough to keep me from breaking, but the jolt still sent pain slicing through my knee. My body screamed in protest as I pulled myself upright, but there was no time to linger. From above, I heard the crash of splintering wood, the dull thud of boots against the door. They were inside now, and it would only take them seconds to see the open window. My breath came in ragged bursts as I forced my legs to move, hobbling into the shadows, the motel shrinking behind me. I ran without direction, limping hard, the pavement striking against the thin soles of my feet with every desperate step. The night swallowed me whole, empty sidewalks, flickering streetlights, the hum of traffic blocks away. My wedding day, the vows, the laughter of my friends, my mother's tears of joy, all of it had collapsed into this frantic escape, this nightmare chase through the dark. The thought cut deep. Hours ago I had been a bride, and now I was a fugitive. Each step sent fire through my ankle, but the pain became part of the rhythm, a drumbeat driving me forward. The motel robe flapped uselessly against my body, doing nothing to keep out the sharp bite of the wind. Yet fear burned hotter than cold ever could. My mind spun with images of flashing police lights, Nathan's face twisted in rage, Melissa's false concern dripping through her text. I imagined them closing in, imagined a hand on my shoulder, and each time the terror pushed me faster, even as my body begged to stop. Block after block blurred together until the adrenaline began to thin, leaving me lightheaded and shaking. My lungs burned, my injured ankles screamed, and the city seemed endless, its empty streets both a refuge and a trap. I slowed, staggering to a walk, listening to the silence pressing in. Behind me, there were no sirens, no footsteps, no shouts, just the faint hum of the city, indifferent to the fact that my life had been turned inside out. For the first time since leaping from that window, I let myself breathe, though every exhale carried the weight of knowing this was only the beginning. I needed to think, but my mind was a storm that refused to settle. Where could I go? What could I possibly do without documents, without real clothes, with nothing but a scattering of bills and a credit card that might already be useless? The only thing of value I had was Nathan's phone, still heavy in my pocket, humming with the proof of everything I had uncovered. It was both my lifeline and a curse, a secret too dangerous to keep and too vital to lose. I stopped beneath the awning of a shuttered shop, clutching my aching side as I tried to catch my breath, the chill of the night pressing into my bones. The streets were quiet now, the city winding down, only the occasional car gliding past, with headlights cutting brief tunnels of light through the darkness. I glanced at the time. Just shy of midnight. My wedding had been that very morning, though it felt like a century had passed since I'd stood in a gown, my mother's hands trembling as she adjusted my veil. The hours in between had stretched into another lifetime, one that had aged me years in the space of a single night. I knew I couldn't stay exposed. I needed somewhere anonymous, somewhere they wouldn't think to look. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and opened a booking app, fumbling so badly I missed the buttons again and again. At last, a listing appeared, a run-down hostel across town, cheap, unremarkable, the kind of place no one bothered to notice. Perfect. I requested a ride, but not from the corner where I stood. I pinned the pickup a few blocks away, a small precaution that gave me the illusion of control. 10 minutes later, a dusty sedan pulled up. The driver, an older man with a salt-and-pepper mustache, who studied me with curious eyes in the rearview mirror. I tugged the motel robe tighter, sinking into the back seat, my pulse hammering at the thought that he might ask questions, might notice too much. But he said nothing. No small talk, no prying. Just turned the key, pulled into the street, and carried me deeper into the sleeping city, while I pressed my hands into my pockets to reassure myself the phone was still there, hidden, silent, the one piece of truth I had left. I gave the driver an address a couple of blocks away from where I was really headed, another layer of precaution in a night that had become nothing but survival. The ride stretched endlessly, every sudden honk outside, every shift of the gears making me flinch deeper into the corner of the back seat. My thoughts tangled and frayed, looping in circles I couldn't control. Just that morning I had been a bride, smiling through tears of joy, and now I was a fugitive, branded in my husband's story as the woman who tried to kill him. By the time the car slowed to a stop, I felt brittle, like one wrong move would shatter me completely. I handed the man cash, slipped out without a word, and walked in the opposite direction until his taillights disappeared around the corner. Only then did I double back, moving quickly but not quite running, my ankles still throbbing, my robe flapping against the cold. The hostel came into view just as I had imagined it, 3 stories of peeling paint, a sign that buzzed with failing neon, a place people passed without noticing, perfect in its forgettability. I pushed through the door, the stale air heavy with the smell of disinfectant and old carpet, and found a young man slouched at the reception desk, earbuds dangling, his head bobbing slightly as though he had been asleep seconds before I arrived. His eyes snapped open when he saw me, and the surprise was plain. I must have looked like a ghost, a woman in a motel robe, hair tangled, face streaked, showing up in the dead of night. His stare lingered too long, so I cut it short with a lie, telling him I'd been mugged, my bag stolen, that I just needed a bed until morning. The words spilled out too fast, but I forced them steady, holding his gaze like I was daring him to call me a liar. His frown told me he didn't buy it, not really, but when I slid my credit card across the counter, the spark of doubt in his eyes dimmed. He barely glanced at me again after that. He processed the payment with a bored flick of his wrist, handed me a keycard, and went back to scrolling his phone as though women in disarray wandered in every night. Clutching the card, I climbed the narrow staircase to the 3rd floor, every creak of the worn carpet reminding me how exposed I still was. The room was just as bleak as I needed it to be, a narrow bed pressed against one wall, a single chair, a flickering lamp. No comforts, no distractions, only 4 walls that felt, for the moment, like the thinnest shield between me and a world already hunting me down. The room was sparse, just a nightstand, a narrow wardrobe, and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. But to me, it felt like a palace, 4 thin walls that were mine alone, at least for now. I locked the door, slid the chain across, and dragged the single chair against the knob until the wood groaned. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding since the motel. For the first time all night, a sliver of stillness settled over me. I told myself I was safe, though the word felt fragile, temporary, like glass ready to crack. I perched on the edge of the bed, Nathan's phone cold and heavy in my hand. It was the only weapon I had, the only shield against the story already being spun without me. My fingers shook as I opened the hidden folder again, the glow of the screen painting the dark room with its pale light. Names and dates filled the screen, each entry as neat and official as a ledger. But the pattern was unmistakable. The lives of women reduced to files. The proof that the man I had loved was nothing but a predator dressed in a groom's smile. The first record, a marriage certificate 6 years old. Elena Carter, maiden name Sokolova. 4 months later, a death certificate, cause listed as a car accident. Nathan hadn't even been in the vehicle, the note said. His alibi impeccable. Insurance payout, $3 million. Then another entry, 2 years later. Anna Carter, married for just 3 months. Cause of death? A balcony fall. No witnesses. Nathan had been at work. Another flawless alibi. Another payout, this time $4 million. And then the third, Irina Carter, married 2 years ago, dead within 5 months. Drowned on their honeymoon, while Nathan was supposedly at the bar fetching drinks. Insurance, $4.5 million. Each line of text made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to keep reading until I reached the most recent entry, my name typed in bold letters, Claire Allen Carter, a marriage less than a day old. No death certificate yet, but the insurance was already filed. $5 million waiting, as though my life had an expiration date stamped on it before I'd even walked down the aisle. The figure on the screen glared back at me. $5 million. That was the price he had set on my life, the value of my existence reduced to a payout. I staggered into the bathroom, gripping the sink as bile surged up my throat. For long moments I just leaned there, trembling, letting the cold tap water run over my hands and splash my face, trying to wash away the sickness that clung to me. When the nausea dulled to a low ache, I forced myself back into the bedroom. I couldn't stop now. The phone still hummed in my hand like a loaded weapon, and I needed to know everything it held. I dug deeper into his contacts, noticing a few entries marked only with initials. One in particular, KM, caught my eye. When I opened the thread, my blood ran cold. A string of brief, coded messages filled the screen, all dated from the months Nathan and I had been courting through our engagement. Target confirmed, documents ready, package received, effect in 30 to 40 minutes. Leaves no trace. My fingers trembled as I scrolled, each line confirming what I had been too blind to see. This wasn't paranoia, this was a plan. The final message in that chain had been sent just this morning, hours before I walked down the aisle in a white dress I now wanted to set on fire. Final tonight. Payment after confirmation. My chest tightened, every word pressing down like a physical weight. He hadn't even tried to cloak it in sentiment or second thoughts. I wasn't a bride to him, I was a transaction, a contract waiting to close. The walls of the tiny room seemed to close in around me as I fought to breathe, the air too thin, too heavy with the truth. Desperate for anything more, I flipped back into his banking app, scrolling through the familiar transactions I had already glimpsed. There they were again, recurring payments that no longer looked like business as usual. Transfers marked with the initials MC. My throat constricted as recognition hit. Melissa Collins, my best friend. The woman who had toasted me at our wedding, who had promised me she'd always have my back. I stared at the glowing screen, the betrayal searing like fire, and realized the conspiracy against me was bigger than just Nathan. It had roots tangled into the one friendship I had thought was unshakable. The last transfer had gone through just yesterday, $200,000, with the bland description of consultation. My throat tightened as the truth sank in. Melissa, my Melissa, the friend who had sat with me through heartbreaks and exams, who had sworn she'd always be family. She had been part of this trap. She hadn't just looked the other way. She had helped Nathan pull me into it. My hand shook as I reopened the photo gallery, staring harder now, forcing myself to see what I had missed before. And there it was, photo after photo of her, captured from a distance, leaving her apartment, sliding into her car, sipping coffee at a cafe. And then the image that made my lungs seize. Melissa and Nathan, together in the dim light of a hotel room, their mouths pressed against each other in a kiss so intimate it erased any shred of doubt. I stared at the date stamped on the corner, 2 weeks ago, the very weekend Melissa had claimed she was away visiting her parents. My vision blurred as betrayal slammed into me harder than even Nathan's attempt on my life. His cruelty I could almost rationalize. He had always been a stranger dressed as a savior. But her? She had been woven into 15 years of my life, stitched into every memory of laughter and tears. She had stood by me in a bridesmaid's dress just hours earlier, her arms wrapped around me, whispering wishes of happiness, knowing full well that the man I had married had marked me for death. I thought of every sleepover, every late-night call, every time I had defended her choices or trusted her advice. Each memory now curdled into poison, proof that she had been smiling while sharpening the knife behind my back. The weight of it pressed so hard on my chest that I thought it might break me, that this betrayal might be the one wound I couldn't recover from. My hands moved before my brain could stop them. I powered on my own phone, desperate to hear her voice, to ask her why, to make her explain how friendship could rot so completely. The screen lit up in an explosion of noise, dozens of missed calls, messages flooding in from Mom, from colleagues, from friends, each one demanding answers I didn't have. My thumb hovered over Melissa's name, the rage and grief boiling together until it was impossible to tell which burned hotter. Melissa's name sat there on the screen, glowing like a wound I couldn't stop prodding. Her messages scrolled in front of me, line after line, dripping with false concern. "Claire, what's happening?" Brandon called and said. "You tried to poison Nathan." "This is crazy. Please answer me. I'm worried. The police are looking for you." Each word felt like a knife twist. She knew. She had always known. She was taking his money, sharing his bed behind my back, and now she was pretending to play the worried friend, trying to lure me into answering. My jaw clenched as I hit call. Fury and heartbreak tangled into one unbearable knot. She picked up after the first ring, her voice breathless, eager, like she'd been waiting with the phone in her hand. She tumbled into the conversation, words spilling fast, asking where I was, why I'd run from the restaurant, saying Nathan was in the hospital, that everyone was frantic. She layered her voice with worry, hitting every note of the friend she had been for 15 years, the friend who had seen me through college, heartbreaks, and celebrations. For a moment, hearing that familiar tone, I almost wanted to believe her, to fall back into the comfort of who I thought she was. But the weight of what I'd seen on Nathan's phone pressed down harder. When she paused for breath, I cut in with one question. Why? My voice shook as I asked it, the word carrying all the grief and disbelief I couldn't contain. Why had she helped him? How much had he paid her for my life? On the other end of the line, silence bloomed, thick and suffocating. For a few seconds I thought the call had dropped, but then she came back, her tone suddenly sharp, defensive. She denied it, over and over, insisting she didn't know what I was talking about. Each denial scraped against me like sandpaper. So I told her. I told her about the photos, about the money wired into her account, about the picture of her and Nathan kissing in that hotel room. The words spilled out like acid, and when I stopped, waiting for her to contradict me, to shout or scream or confess, there was nothing. Just silence again, not even a gasp, not even outrage at being accused. The quiet on the other end of the line said more than words ever could. My heart broke in that silence because it was the sound of a friendship rotting all the way through. Then her voice changed, the warmth drained out of it, leaving something hard, sharp, and unrecognizable. She told me I was crazy, that I was imagining things, that I didn't have any real proof. The tone was meant to cut me down, to push me back into doubt. But then she said the words that sealed it. "Where are you right now? I'll come to you. We'll talk. Just tell me where you are." My stomach turned. The woman I'd trusted most wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. She wanted me to give myself up, to step right into her hands. A laugh escaped me, bitter and ragged, nothing like the girl she used to know. I told her not to bother, that I wouldn't tell her where I was, not ever. And then I twisted the knife back. I said the proof was in my hands, on Nathan's phone, and that I wasn't letting it go. For the first time in that call, she lost her composure. Melissa's voice rose to a frantic pitch, shrieking that I had stolen his phone, that I was insane, that I needed to return it immediately. Her panic wasn't about my well-being, it was about the evidence I now carried. That was all I needed. The confirmation was right there, wrapped in her fury. I ended the call mid-scream, blocked her number, and powered down my phone until the screen went black. They would be looking for me now, I was certain of it. Nathan, Melissa, maybe even the police, but in that moment, clutching the device to my chest, I felt the smallest flicker of power. For once, I held the truth, not them. I lay back on the thin mattress, hugging the phone as if it were the only shield I had left in the world. Exhaustion came fast, heavy and merciless, dragging me down before I could think any further. My last clear thought before sleep claimed me was a promise to myself. Tomorrow, I would find a lawyer, someone who could help me turn this evidence into protection, into justice. I didn't hear myself drift off, but I woke with a jolt, heart hammering, to the sound of a knock at the door, sharp, demanding. For a few seconds, I didn't even know where I was, the dark room spinning, until the dread returned. They had found me, again. The memories crashed back in an instant. Wedding vows, the restaurant, the poisoned glass, the frantic escape. The knock came again, sharper this time, and I froze where I sat, too afraid even to breathe. My mind spiraled through every possibility. Police? Nathan's people? How had they tracked me down so quickly? Then came a woman's voice, muffled but clear through the door. Housekeeping, asking if I had ordered extra towels. My stomach clenched. I hadn't asked for anything. Every instinct screamed it was a trap. I slid off the bed as quietly as I could and crept to the door, pressing my eye to the peephole. A woman stood there in a maid's uniform, arms loaded with towels, her posture too rigid, her gaze fixed on the door as though she could see through it. Something about her stance, the unnatural stillness, prickled along my skin. "Just leave them by the door, thank you," I called out, forcing my voice into something calm and casual. She hesitated for a heartbeat before finally bending down, setting the stack on the floor, and walking away. I stayed frozen, listening hard as her footsteps receded down the hallway. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Maybe I was unraveling, maybe it really was nothing more than a maid doing her job. My nerves were strung so tight they could invent monsters out of shadows. Still, I waited several long minutes before inching the chair away from the knob and cracking the door open just wide enough to reach. The towels lay neatly stacked, exactly as she had left them. I grabbed them quickly, pulling them inside, then shut the door fast and shoved the chair back under the handle, my pulse pounding in my ears. It wasn't until I dropped the bundle onto the bed that I noticed the slip of paper nestled between the folds. My fingers went numb as I unfolded it. Just 5 words, scrawled in dark ink. "They know you're here." The message burned into me, erasing whatever fragile sense of safety I had managed to cling to. My knees wobbled beneath me, and I sank onto the mattress, clutching the paper with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, realizing there was nowhere left to hide. The note was short, urgent, written in a hand I didn't recognize. "Leave immediately." No signature, no clue who had slipped it to me. A warning, or a trap. My pulse hammered as I rushed to the window and peered down into the pale light of morning. A police cruiser idled at the curb, 2 officers standing with the hostel clerk, his arms waving as he pointed upward, toward me. My throat constricted. Someone had given me away. The walls pressed closer with every second, and I spun in circles searching for an exit that didn't exist. Panic clawed at me until my gaze returned to the window. 3 stories up, too far to jump, but just beyond the glass, branches swayed, reaching close enough to touch. A tree. A chance, however slim. My hands shook as I shoved the towels aside and stuffed both phones, my cash, and the credit card deep into my robe pockets. It felt absurd to climb into danger dressed like this, but I had no choice. Every instinct screamed that if I stayed, I was finished. I shoved the window open, and the crisp dawn air slapped my face awake. The branch was nearer than I'd first thought, though still a stretch. Behind me, the pounding on the door began again, sharper, angrier. "Police! Open up!" The authority in that voice left no room for hesitation. My palms slick with sweat. I swung one leg over the sill, pressing my chest against the frame as I reached out. My fingers closed around the rough bark just as the door splintered, the lock groaning in protest. The branch dipped alarmingly under my weight, creaking like it might snap, but it held. I clung to it with everything I had, dragging the rest of my body out onto the ledge. The wood scraped my skin, biting into my palms, but I didn't let go. With one desperate heave, I threw my other leg over, clinging like a child on a jungle gym, just as the sound of wood cracking split the air behind me. They were breaking down the door. My breath tore through my chest as I pressed tighter against the tree, praying it wouldn't betray me, praying I could disappear into the leaves before they stormed the room. I drew in a sharp breath and leapt. The branch groaned, bending under my weight, and for a moment I was certain it would snap and send me crashing to the ground. Somehow it held, and I clung to it like an animal, my arms trembling as I groped with my feet for something solid. My toes finally brushed against a lower limb, and I scrambled down onto it, hugging the trunk as though it could shield me from the shouts erupting above. Then came the crash of the door giving way, the furious voices flooding into the room I had just abandoned. They knew I was gone. Panic shot through me, and I abandoned caution, clawing my way downward, bark tearing at my hands, branches whipping against my arms. I moved faster, desperate, the fear of being dragged back eclipsing the fear of falling. When I reached the last stretch, I didn't hesitate. I jumped, the impact jarring through my legs as I hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind from me. Pain radiated from my ankle again, but I forced myself up and bolted, darting across the grass and away from the hostel, keeping the parked cruiser out of sight. I turned corners blindly, one after another, until my lungs burned and every breath came ragged. My robe flapped wildly around me, my bare legs screaming with cold, but I didn't stop until I found the shadowed alley of a narrow courtyard. I collapsed against a wall, tucking myself behind a row of dumpsters, my chest heaving as I strained to listen. Nothing but the pounding of my own heart. For the moment, I was invisible, but invisibility wouldn't last. I had to think. I had to act. The reality struck me like a hammer. The police were hunting me now, armed with Nathan's story and my disappearance to back it up. My reflection was probably already plastered across their radios. In this ridiculous robe, I looked like a caricature, a runaway mental patient instead of a woman fighting for her life. I needed proof, something undeniable, something I could use when the walls finally closed in. My hand shook as I pulled Nathan's phone from my pocket and pressed the screen awake. The glow lit up my face as I whispered to myself, there had to be more, and I was going to find it before they found me. When the phone lit up, I expected the familiar lock screen, the one that had opened doors to Nathan's hidden life. Instead, a cold message glared back at me. Device locked remotely. Contact administrator. My stomach dropped. Nathan, or maybe his brother, had shut it down. Just like that, everything I'd uncovered, the photos, the documents, the messages, was gone, sealed behind a wall I couldn't break. My last hope of proof had been ripped away. A cry tore from my throat, and I slammed my fist against the pavement, the sting in my knuckles nothing compared to the hollow ache spreading through my chest. I pulled out my own phone, hesitating as the weight of risk pressed down on me. If they were tracking me, turning this on could lead them straight here. But I had no other choice. I needed someone who might still believe me, someone who hadn't already been pulled into Nathan's story. With trembling hands, I powered it up, and the screen immediately lit with a flood of notifications. Dozens of calls. messages stacked into endless lines, each one another reminder of the chaos I had left behind. I ignored them all and tapped the only number that mattered. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been holding the phone to her chest, waiting. "Claire?" My mother's voice cracked, full of tears, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. She asked where I was, what had happened, why I had run. She told me the police had already been to the house, asking questions, their eyes sharp with suspicion. She said Nathan was in the hospital but out of danger, and everyone was whispering that I had tried to poison him. Each word piled heavier on my chest, suffocating me with the picture of guilt they had painted around me. I tried to explain, words spilling faster than I could control. I told her about the waiter, about the glass I had switched at the last second, about the folder of documents detailing Nathan's other wives, their deaths, the insurance policies, Melissa's betrayal. My voice cracked as I laid it all out, the nightmare that had swallowed me whole. On the other end of the line, silence stretched, my mother saying nothing, only the faint sound of her breath. The silence cut deeper than any accusation because it carried the one thing I couldn't bear, doubt. For a long time, all I could hear was her breathing, heavy and uneven, as if she were steadying herself before saying what she didn't want to. When she finally spoke, her words felt like a stranger's. "Claire, are you taking your medication?" The world seemed to tilt beneath me. Medication. She was reaching back 3 years, to the dark months after my father died, when grief had nearly drowned me and antidepressants had been the only rope I clung to. That chapter of my life had ended long ago, but in her voice, I heard the doubt, the suspicion that the woman on the other end of the line wasn't her daughter fighting for survival, but her daughter slipping back into madness. I rushed to defend myself, stumbling over my own words. I told her again that this was real, that Nathan had tried to kill me, that I had swapped the glasses just in time, that the evidence had been on his phone until he, or his brother, locked it remotely. I begged her to believe me, to remember the girl she had raised, the one who could tell the difference between fear and delusion. But the more I spoke, the softer and more cautious her voice became, as though each word only deepened her concern. "Claire, listen to me," she said finally, her tone deliberate, coaxing. "Tell me where you are, I'll come get you, and we'll go to the police together. Everything will be all right, I promise." I knew that tone too well. It was the voice you used with someone fragile, someone unstable, someone who couldn't be trusted with her own reality. She thought I was unraveling, inventing shadows, mistaking paranoia for proof. To her, I wasn't a woman who had escaped an attempt on her life. I was a patient again, a problem to be managed. Tears burned hot behind my eyes as I choked out, "Mom, I'm not crazy. Everything I've told you is true. Nathan tried to kill me. I had the evidence, but it's gone now. Please, you have to believe me." On the other end, her reply came in the same soothing cadence, each word a pat on the head I didn't want. "Of course, sweetheart," she said gently, as if humoring a child lost in a nightmare. The sound of her voice, meant to comfort, only hollowed me out. Because in that moment, I understood. I was utterly alone. "I believe you. Just tell me where you are, and I'll come." Her voice had softened into a lie she thought I couldn't hear. She didn't believe me. No one would. Without Nathan's phone, I had nothing but my word against his, and the weight of his reputation crushed mine before I could even speak. A successful, polished businessman versus the unstable wife with a history of depression. It was no contest. My chest tightened as I ended the call and powered my phone down, the screen going black like a door slamming shut. Tears slid hot and unchecked down my face. I didn't bother wiping them away. I was completely alone. The hours that followed blurred together in the stink of garbage and the bite of the cold concrete at my back. I stayed crouched behind the dumpsters, too afraid to move, my stomach gnawing at itself, my throat dry. Hunger and thirst clawed at me, but fear kept me still. If anyone saw me like this, barefoot and wrapped in a motel robe, they would stare, remember, maybe even tell someone, and then it would be over. I hugged my knees, trying to make myself smaller, invisible, until the sun began to rise higher and the noise of the city forced me into a decision. I had to know what the world was saying about me, whether Nathan's version had already spread like wildfire, whether my name was being dragged through headlines. If there was even a sliver of a chance to find a lawyer who could help me, I had to take it. My legs ached as I pulled myself up and left my hiding spot, walking with my head down toward the busier streets. The plan came together in fragments: an internet cafe, a public Wi-Fi signal, anywhere I could get online without being tracked. Maybe a shopping center where no one would notice one more tired woman slipping in. The mall was only a few blocks away. I kept my eyes on the sidewalk, weaving through the early morning crowd, praying no one would look too closely. In a city this size, a woman in a robe might earn a glance, maybe a shake of the head, but people had seen stranger things and moved on. Inside, the cool blast of air conditioning hit me, and I made a beeline for the discount clothing store. I spent nearly everything I had left on a pair of plain jeans, a t-shirt, and cheap sneakers. In the cramped fitting room, I pulled them on, leaving the robe crumpled in a corner. When I stepped out, I felt almost like a ghost wrapped in someone else's life. But at least I no longer looked like a runaway patient. Dressed in jeans and a plain t-shirt, I finally looked like anyone else, just another woman out for coffee, nothing to draw a second glance. I let myself believe, for a moment, that I could melt into the crowd, that anonymity might be possible. I ducked into a cafe with a faded sign promising free Wi-Fi, ordered the cheapest coffee on the menu, and slid into a corner seat. The bitter steam rose from the paper cup as I powered on my phone again. My stomach knotted so tight I could hardly swallow. The connection blinked to life, and I opened the browser with shaking hands. My name lit up the screen like a flare. It was everywhere. Top searches, breaking headlines. I clicked the first article, and the floor seemed to drop out beneath me. Black widow bride tries to poison husband on their wedding night. The words screamed at me, cruel and sensational, and beneath them Nathan's face appeared, pale but triumphant, speaking to a reporter from his hospital bed. He told the world I had laced his wine, that he had noticed, that he had cleverly switched the glasses when I wasn't looking, that the poison meant for him had ended up in his system, but thanks to swift medical help, he had survived. Line after line painted me as a monster. My supposed plan, my supposed malice. It was all laid out in gruesome detail, spun perfectly into the story he wanted told. And it wasn't just his voice amplifying the lie. There was Melissa, tears streaking her cheeks in a posed photograph, lamenting how I had grown distant and secretive, how she had feared something was wrong but never imagined it could come to this. Every word from her was a knife twisting deeper, her betrayal now carved into print for strangers to consume. And then my mother's voice appeared in text, trembling, careful, describing the dark months after my father died, the depression that had gripped me, her fear that I might never recover. Her words weren't meant to damn me, I knew that, but laid bare in black and white, they sealed Nathan's story with the weight of credibility. To anyone reading, it sounded inevitable that the fragile daughter, the unstable bride, had finally snapped. I stared at the screen, my hands numb around the coffee cup, and realized the truth was no longer mine. It belonged to the headlines, to Nathan, to the world that was already convinced of my guilt. My mother's words echoed in my head from the article, how grateful she had been when Nathan came into my life, how she had thought he'd pulled me out of the darkness after my father died. There were photos from the wedding scattered between the paragraphs, me in white, smiling like I believed the world was safe again, Nathan looking at me like he had already won. And then, beneath it all, my passport photo stamped with the word, wanted. It didn't matter what I said anymore. To the world, I was already branded, a deranged bride who had tried to kill her husband. I made the mistake of opening my social media. The inbox was flooded with messages, most from names I didn't recognize. The words blurred together, threats, insults, curses. Strangers telling me I deserved prison, pain, even death. Some called me a monster, others a lunatic, but all of them agreed on one thing: I was guilty. My stomach twisted, bile rising as I slammed the app shut. Searching for something, anything, I opened my bank account next. The screen went red with a single word. Blocked. They'd frozen everything. No money. No escape. It hit me then. I had nothing left. No friends, no family to lean on, no reputation to protect me. Only the truth, and no one who wanted to hear it. I drained the last of my cheap coffee, the bitterness coating my tongue as I forced myself to think. Should I surrender, walk into a police station, and beg them to believe me? But without proof, they'd cage me as a criminal, or worse. Commit me, let Nathan's story become the only one that mattered. Running seemed impossible, too. No documents, no funds, no plan. I was cornered. And yet, a flicker of hope pushed through the panic. There had been one witness, one person who had risked enough to whisper a warning. The waiter. He had seen what Nathan did, had seen enough to know the danger. If I could find him, maybe I could pry the truth into daylight. My hands trembled as I pulled up the restaurant's website, scrolling until I found the phone number. With a steadying breath, I dialed, disguising my voice as best I could. When someone answered, I introduced myself as a journalist, working on a piece about the incident. It was a lie, but the only kind of lie that might save my life. I asked if I could speak to the waiter who had handled our table the night before, the one who had whispered the words that saved my life. The manager's tone was clipped, rehearsed. No comments, he said, before adding almost as an afterthought that the waiter had resigned that very morning. Just like that. Gone. No calls returned, no word left behind. Resigned or erased. The implication made my stomach lurch. Nathan had the money, the influence, the reach. Silencing a single low-wage employee would cost him nothing. I thanked the manager with a voice that sounded far steadier than I felt and ended the call. Another lifeline snapped, leaving me dangling over the abyss with nothing to cling to. I sat frozen in the cafe, the lukewarm coffee untouched, until movement at the entrance caught my eye. 2 uniformed officers walked in, their eyes scanning the crowd with a deliberate slowness, stopping on faces, measuring every expression. My pulse spiked, panic clawing at my throat. Were they here for me? Of course they were. The net was tightening, strand by strand. I forced myself to stand, fighting every instinct to bolt. Running would give me away. Instead, I slipped my bag over my shoulder and walked toward the opposite exit, steady, deliberate, as though I had every right to be there. My legs felt like rubber, my skin hot and prickling under their gaze, but I didn't look back. Outside, the cool air struck me like a slap, and I kept moving, my steps quickening as I rounded the corner. My eyes darted to the street ahead, searching for escape, for anonymity, the subway. It was my only option now. Down there, among the tide of commuters, I could disappear, just another tired face in a sea of strangers. I set my course for the nearest station, head down, pace brisk but not hurried, my breath tight in my chest. If I could ride the train out to the edge of the city, I might buy myself a few hours, maybe a day, enough time to plan my next move, enough time to decide whether survival meant hiding or fighting back. The subway swallowed me in its dim light and stale air, the turnstiles clattering shut behind me as I fed them my last few coins. On the platform, I tried to look like everyone else, tired, distracted, just waiting for a train. But then I felt it, that weight of being watched. I turned, and there he was, a man in his 40s, dressed plainly enough to disappear into any crowd, standing only a few yards away with his eyes fixed directly on me. When our gazes met, he shifted, almost too smoothly, pulling out his phone and lifting it to his ear. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was unraveling, reading too much into the glance of a stranger, but I couldn't afford maybe any more. The train screeched into the station, brakes shrieking against metal, and I stepped inside, heart pounding. He followed, slipping into the car through a different set of doors, positioning himself just far enough away to keep me in his line of sight. He pretended to scroll his phone, but I could feel his attention, sharp as a blade. The next stop came, the doors sliding open. At the very last second, I darted out, squeezing through the narrowing gap. His head jerked up, eyes widening, and he moved, but too late. The doors clapped shut between us, carrying him away with the train. My pulse thundered as I climbed the stairs two at a time, lungs burning, desperate for the open air. When I emerged onto the street, the fading daylight hit me like a warning. I wasn't just paranoid, I was being hunted. From that moment, every shadow became a threat. I walked fast, then slow, doubling back, ducking into shops and slipping out through side doors. I checked my reflection in windows, searching for shapes that followed too closely. Each turn only heightened the certainty pressing down on me. It wasn't only the police. Nathan had unleashed his reach, and now his people were everywhere. As the sky darkened into night, the streets grew colder, emptier, and I realized with a hollow ache that I had nowhere left to run. Everyone I had ever known believed the headlines, that I was a killer unraveling under the weight of my own madness. My accounts were frozen, my name poisoned, and I was down to nothing. I drifted into a 24-hour grocery store, not for food, but for shelter, to disappear for a little while among the bright aisles and humming refrigerators. I walked slowly past shelves, pretending to compare prices, fingers trailing along plastic packaging I couldn't afford, just buying time in the illusion of normal life. My chest still ached with the question that never left me. What now? And then I saw him. At first my brain refused to accept it, but there he was, the waiter from the restaurant, the one whose whisper had saved me. He stood at the register, paying for a modest handful of groceries, looking like any other exhausted man at the end of his shift. I froze, pulse spiking, afraid he might vanish if I blinked. This was it, my only chance to find someone who could confirm my truth. My legs carried me forward before I even realized I was moving. I caught up to him just as he stepped into the night, calling out softly, my voice trembling but insistent. He turned, and the look on his face was a mirror of my own. Shock, recognition, and something darker. Fear. You, he whispered, scanning the parking lot nervously. The police are looking everywhere for you. His words landed heavy, but I nodded, begging him with my eyes not to turn away, not to leave me stranded in this nightmare. The words poured out of me, spilling faster than I could control. I told him everything. The poisoned glass, Nathan's lies, the headlines painting me as a monster. My voice broke as I explained how I had no one left, no proof, nothing but his warning that night to keep me alive. He listened, his gaze darting left and right, shoulders tense, as though any second someone might overhear and drag us both under. When I finally fell silent, his pause stretched long enough to crush me. But then, quietly, almost reluctantly, he said, "I saw him. He put something in your glass." The words sent a jolt through me, fragile but blazing like the first spark of hope. "That's why I warned you," he whispered, his voice raw with fear. "But I can't testify. He found me this morning. He said if I ever told anyone what I saw, he'd kill me and my family." My stomach dropped, the fragile spark of hope extinguished in an instant. My last thread was unraveling right in front of me. I leaned closer, my words breaking into a plea. "Please, you're the only one who can save me. Without you, I'll be locked away forever, and Nathan will keep walking free until he finds another woman to bury." He shook his head, his eyes wet with a sorrow that cut deeper than anger. "I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. But I have children. I can't risk them." The words closed around me like a fist. He turned to leave, his groceries swinging at his side, his back a verdict I couldn't change. And then, just as he reached the corner, he stopped. Slowly, he turned back, his gaze locking with mine, something undecided flickering in his expression. "There are cameras in the restaurant," he said softly, almost conspiratorial. "They face the floor. If you can get the footage from last night, you'll see it all. Him dropping something in your glass, you switching them. It's there." His voice trembled, but he didn't wait for my reply. He simply turned and melted into the crowd, leaving me with only the echo of his words. Cameras. Yes. Of course. In a place that expensive, every detail would be recorded. My pulse quickened, the first stirrings of determination sparking again. If I could get those tapes, I could prove everything. But the police had surely taken them already, or worse, Nathan had buried them. Still, it was something, a direction. I stood there replaying his words until headlights broke my trance. A black SUV rolled slowly down the street, its windows dark, its presence deliberate. As it drew closer, I recognized the driver. Nathan's brother, Tyler. His gaze locked onto mine, sharp with recognition. My breath caught. He had found me. I ran blind, my feet pounding against the pavement, lungs tearing with every gasp. Behind me came the screech of brakes, the slam of a car door. Tyler was out of the SUV, and I could feel the weight of his pursuit even without looking back. I darted through courtyards, hurdling benches, weaving past the skeletons of playgrounds. My chest burned, my side stabbed with pain, but stopping wasn't an option. This wasn't about being arrested. It was about survival. They wanted me silenced, and silence meant death. Every corner I turned, every shadow I slipped into, carried the raw panic that he was a step behind. My thoughts blurred into one mantra: don't stop, don't stop. My legs moved on instinct, powered by terror more than strength, until I rounded another corner and stumbled into the glow of a sign that felt almost like a miracle: a hostel, open 24 hours. Anonymous enough to vanish inside, at least for a moment. I bolted across the street and pushed through the glass doors, my heart slamming against my ribs. The lobby was deserted, quiet, in a way that felt wrong. The only sign of life was the reception desk, where a brass bell sat atop a folded note that read, "Ring for assistance." The stillness pressed against me, but I didn't dare make a sound that might draw attention from outside. My hands shook as I gripped the railing and forced myself past the desk without hesitation. The stairwell loomed ahead, dim and narrow, and I fled upward, every creak of the wooden steps echoing like a drumbeat of exposure. First floor, second, third. My breath rasped in the silence, my ears straining for the sound of the door below bursting open, of footsteps pounding after me. Each step felt like it might be my last chance to stay ahead, the fragile line between being hunted and being caught. By the time I reached the fourth floor, I had to stop, pressing myself against the wall, ears straining. Voices echoed from below, footsteps, murmurs, too muffled to make out, but close enough to freeze the blood in my veins. Was it Tyler? Was it the police? I couldn't risk finding out. I pushed upward again, my legs burning, until the stairwell ended at a door that gave way easily to my touch. The rooftop. I slipped through and pulled it shut behind me, the chill of the night air rushing over my skin like water. The city sprawled beneath me, its glow indifferent to my terror. I crept to the ledge and looked down. 5 stories, a leap that would break me before it saved me. My eyes searched the rooftop's edges, desperate for escape. And there it was, a rusted fire escape bolted to the far side of the building. Old, corroded, but it was hope. I crossed the gravel surface on shaking legs, my breath shallow, rehearsing how I might climb down without falling. Then the rooftop door banged open. I spun, panic clawing at my throat, and ducked behind a ventilation shaft, pressing my body against the cold metal. The hinges groaned as the door swung wide, and Tyler stepped into the night. The gun in his hand gleamed under the weak rooftop light, erasing any illusions I had left. He wasn't here to take me in. He was here to end me. He moved slowly, deliberately, sweeping his gaze across the rooftop as if he had all the time in the world. His shoes crunched against gravel, each step echoing closer, his free hand sliding along the metal railings as though savoring the hunt. I held my breath, my chest aching, my lungs screaming for air. He checked behind pipes, vents, every shadow. And then his path curved toward me. My heart thudded so violently, I feared he would hear it. In seconds, he would reach the shaft, and then there would be nowhere left to hide. My eyes darted wildly, searching for anything, any edge, any tool, before his shadow reached me. Beside the vent, scattered in a heap of dust and plaster, lay the remnants of some repair work. Pipes, chunks of concrete, scraps of metal. My fingers closed around a length of rebar, cold and heavy, and I gripped it with both hands. It was crude, but it was all I had. The rooftop felt suddenly smaller, the night air sharper, as I forced myself to believe I might survive. Then he rounded the vent, and our eyes locked. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then the gun came up, black steel aimed squarely at my face. I didn't think. I swung. The bar cracked against his arm with a sickening thud, and his cry tore through the night. The pistol clattered onto the gravel, skidding out of reach. For an instant, victory surged in me, hot and desperate. I swung again, aiming for his head, but he ducked, the bar grazing his shoulder instead. Pain twisted his features, but it only seemed to fuel him. With a roar, he lunged, slamming into me. The rebar flew from my hands as we crashed onto the rooftop, rolling across the gravel. His weight crushed down, his fists clawing for control, his breath hot with rage. He was stronger, heavier, but survival lent me a feral strength, and I kicked, shoved, scratched, anything to keep him from pinning me. By some miracle I broke free, stumbling to my feet, the fire escape only steps away. I lunged for it, heart hammering, but his grip clamped tight around my ankle, yanking me down hard. Pain shot through my bones as my body hit the concrete, the taste of iron filling my mouth. He loomed over me, his face contorted, eyes blazing with fury and certainty. The fight had stripped away any pretense. He wasn't here to scare me, or to drag me back. He was here to finish what his brother had started. His fist came down with the force of a hammer, but I rolled just in time, the blow cracking against concrete where my head had been. The pain in his knuckles bought me a precious second, and I scrambled upright, running for the fire escape with every ounce of strength left in me. My hands found the cold rails, and this time nothing stopped me. I clattered down the stairs, skipping steps, the metal rattling beneath my weight. Above me, curses ripped through the night, his voice thick with rage. He followed, slower now, his injured arm dragging at him, but still too close. When my feet hit the pavement, I didn't think. I ran. My lungs screamed, my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare slow. The hostel, the rooftop, the gun, they all blurred into the darkness behind me. I tore down alleys, across streets, until the burn in my chest forced me to stop. I ducked into a shadowed courtyard, pressed myself against the rough brick, and gasped for air. Every sound, a passing car, the slam of a distant door, felt like it might be him. My whole body trembled with exhaustion and adrenaline. The truth was impossible to ignore. I had nowhere left to turn. The police branded me a killer. My mother thought I was spiraling back into madness. Melissa, my closest friend, had betrayed me for money and for Nathan's bed. And Nathan himself, along with Tyler, wouldn't stop until I was dead. I was cornered, stripped of everything I had ever relied on. Yet beneath the terror, a spark flared. I wasn't finished. Not yet. I still had a purpose. Somewhere, locked away on a server or a hard drive, were the restaurant's security recordings, proof that Nathan had poisoned my glass, proof that I had switched them. That was my lifeline, the thread that could pull me out of this pit. My body ached, my throat was raw, but the thought steadied me. I would find those tapes. I would bring his crimes into the light. I would survive, and I would make him pay for everything he had done. The mantra repeated in my head as I pushed myself from the wall and walked back into the night, determined to endure until I found a place to hide. The money was gone, my phone dead in my pocket, and I was left wandering the city like a ghost. No charge cord, no lifeline, just me and the endless dark streets that stretched ahead. Every shadow seemed sharper, every sound louder. Police cruisers rolled past at intervals, their lights flashing like predators' eyes, and each time I pressed myself into a doorway or ducked behind trash bins, praying I blended with the filth. My body sagged under the weight of exhaustion, legs heavy, shoulders aching, eyelids stinging with sleeplessness. I hadn't closed my eyes in over 24 hours, and every step felt like it might be the one that made me collapse. Eventually, I stumbled into a small park, the kind that during the day would host mothers with strollers, kids with ice cream cones, but at night was deserted. A few benches lined the paths, and one in particular sat tucked behind a hedge. It wasn't safety, but it was shelter enough for a moment. I sank onto the hardwood, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to shrink into nothing. My head dropped forward, and the relief of stillness was so powerful it scared me. Just for a minute, I told myself, just a minute to gather my strength, but sleep is a thief. It crept in quietly, stealing my defenses, and when I opened my eyes again, the world was filled with harsh white light. Disoriented, I blinked against it, heart racing as confusion smothered me. For a few moments, I didn't know where I was, if I was still dreaming, if Nathan's face would be the one waiting in the shadows. Then the voices reached me, firm and unfamiliar, and reality snapped back into place. 2 officers stood over me, their uniforms unmistakable in the glare of the flashlight. One held the beam steady on my face, unblinking, while the other's hand hovered near his holster. Their expressions were a mixture of suspicion and recognition, and I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. After everything I had run from, everything I had endured, it was happening again. I was cornered, spotlighted like prey with nowhere left to hide. They asked what I was doing out here in the middle of the night, whether I had any identification, their voices sharp but not yet hostile. I opened my mouth, searching for something, any lie, any excuse that might sound believable. But my mind was fogged, my body too wrung out to keep pace. Words slipped away before I could form them. I was too tired, too broken to invent a story. All I could do was stand there in the harsh circle of their flashlight, swaying slightly, as though the weight of my own exhaustion might knock me to the ground. One of them leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied my face. He muttered something low to his partner, who immediately pulled out his phone. The glow of the screen illuminated his features as he scrolled, then looked back up at me. In that instant, their expressions changed, tightening with recognition. Not a vagrant anymore, not a lost woman, a fugitive. "Claire Copeland?" the first one asked, his tone clipped and tense. Hearing my name like that, my wanted name, hit me harder than the handcuffs that followed. I could have denied it, could have tried to bolt into the shadows, but where would I go? For what? I was too drained to run another step, too crushed to fight. My head dipped and I gave the smallest nod. Everything blurred after that. Rough hands pulled me upright, wrenched my arms behind me, cold metal locked around my wrists, the ratchet of the cuffs snapping like a final verdict. Their voices droned in my ears as they recited my rights, words I had only ever heard in films, now binding me in reality. I didn't resist. I didn't have the strength left in me. They guided me across the park like I was a marionette with its strings pulled taut, placing me into the back of a waiting squad car. One officer slid in beside me, the other took the wheel. The engine rumbled, and the city began to blur past the window in streaks of neon and darkness. My reflection in the glass looked hollow, unfamiliar. As the car carried me deeper into the night, a single thought echoed, heavy and certain. This was the end. I was going to prison for a crime I hadn't committed, and no one in the world believed my truth. Maybe prison wasn't even the worst fate. Maybe they would lock me away in a psychiatric ward, declare me unstable, medicate me into silence. Either way, Nathan would walk free, and women I didn't even know yet would pay the price with their lives. That thought hollowed me out more than the cuffs or the cell. At the station, they moved me along briskly, efficient and impersonal. My fingerprints smeared across ink, the flash of a camera freezing my hollow stare. They took my shoelaces, my belt, even the earrings from my ears, stripping away the smallest things that could mark control. Then came the slam of the cell door, the echo reverberating through the concrete box. The room was bare, unforgiving, a metal cot, a toilet crouched in the corner, a sink. Nothing more. I sat on the cot and curled my arms tight around my knees, trying to keep myself from unraveling. The tears came without warning, spilling hot down my cheeks, not loud sobs, but a steady leak of grief and terror. For the first time since this nightmare began, I stopped fighting them, letting them run their course in the stillness. Time stretched strangely there, minutes, hours, maybe both, and I drifted into a half-sleep, my body too exhausted to hold itself upright. The scrape of metal against metal jolted me awake. The cell door groaned open and a woman in uniform appeared, her expression unreadable. "Interrogation," she said flatly. My body moved on instinct, weary but obedient, as I extended my hands. The cuffs clicked shut again, the weight of them somehow heavier now. She led me down a corridor that seemed to stretch forever, each fluorescent light humming above us, each echo of my footsteps loud enough to betray my fear. The interrogation room was exactly like every movie had promised: sterile, clinical, suffocating. A table, 2 chairs, a large mirror glinting coldly on the wall, concealing eyes I couldn't see. Behind the table sat 2 figures, a man and a woman in tailored suits, their faces sharp with practiced neutrality. They looked at me like I was a puzzle they already knew the answer to, only waiting for me to confirm it. I sat down, the cuffs biting into my wrists, and braced myself for whatever story they were about to carve into me. They sat me down across from them, the woman officer slipping off my cuffs before leaving the room with a click of the door that felt final. The 2 across the table introduced themselves, but their names slid right past me. I was too focused on their eyes, on the weight of judgment that seemed to hover before a single question had been asked. The first inquiries came calmly. How long I had known Nathan, what kind of marriage we had, what had happened that night in the restaurant. I answered as steadily as I could, giving them every detail, every fragment: the waiter's warning, the switch of the glasses, the discovery of files and photographs on Nathan's phone. The man across from her glanced at his notes, then spoke with casual cruelty. "Nathan's phone was on him when he was admitted to the hospital. It's in police custody now. So whose phone are you talking about?" The implication hung in the air, that I was inventing evidence, chasing ghosts. I leaned forward, pleading, my words tumbling faster, insisting on what I had seen, on what I knew. But the more I pressed, the more I felt the floor slipping out from under me, as though I were digging my own grave with every sentence. The interrogation stretched on, hour after hour, their questions circling back like vultures. The same events, rephrased, twisted, meant to catch me in a slip, but my story never wavered, because it was the truth. Still, with each repetition, I heard myself through their ears, my own voice starting to sound unhinged, frantic, desperate. I left the words hanging in the stale air of that room, my body trembling, my mind clinging to the one fact that sustained me. Even if they didn't believe me now, I could not stop telling the truth. At last the questioning ended, leaving me wrung out and hollow, as if I had been drained of every ounce of strength. The female officer returned and wordlessly gestured for me to rise. As we walked the corridor back toward my cell, she spoke in a tone that was almost casual, almost kind, but no less devastating. In the morning, I would be taken to court for a hearing. Most likely, she said, I would be held in custody until trial. The words clanged in my head like iron bars closing. Back in the cell, I collapsed onto the cot, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind spun with fragments, faces, threats, flashes of that poisoned glass, until the lines blurred and I couldn't tell fear from memory anymore. When the door creaked open again, it was morning. The officer carried a tray with a bowl of grey porridge and a cup of weak tea. I tried to force a few spoonfuls down, but the food turned to paste in my throat, impossible to swallow. The tea was all I managed, its thin warmth doing nothing to steady the tremor in my hands. Within the hour they came again, and the routine repeated. Cuffs snapping around my wrists, the tug of their grip steering me through the halls like an object rather than a person. Outside the station, a transport car waited. My stomach knotted as I stepped into the light of day, the weight of eyes already pressing against me. The crowd was there, gathered like carrion birds, microphones and cameras raised, their shouts rising in a storm. The officers flanked me, but it wasn't protection. It was escort into humiliation. The air cracked with camera flashes, each one freezing me mid-step, hollow-eyed, disheveled, my wrists bound. Their questions were knives flung from every direction. Why had I tried to kill my husband? How long had I been planning it? How much did I stand to gain? The accusations were asked as if they were facts, their voices tinged with hunger for the spectacle, not the truth. I bowed my head, my hair falling forward like a shield, and let the officers guide me into the car. Inside, the door slammed shut, muffling the roar, but the images of their faces, their jeers, lingered in my mind. In that moment, I understood fully. I wasn't a woman fighting for her life anymore. I was already a headline, a villain in someone else's story. They listened in silence, their faces unreadable masks, but I could feel it, the skepticism thick as smoke. In their eyes, I wasn't a survivor. I was either a cold-blooded poisoner or a fragile woman unraveling under her own delusions. When I finished, the woman leaned forward, her voice smooth but edged. "Do you have proof?" My throat tightened as I explained about Nathan's phone, about the hidden folder of insurance documents and pictures of his previous wives, about how the device had been locked remotely before I could secure anything. The flashes didn't stop, even through the tinted window of the van. They burned through the glass, searing into my eyes, until I dropped my head, hiding my face behind my hair, wishing I could vanish into nothing. The courthouse was no sanctuary. It was a stage, and I was the villain paraded across it. Journalists swarmed at every entrance. Their questions shouted more like accusations than inquiries, their cameras desperate to catch every flicker of my shame. Even the side door they led me through wasn't safe. Reporters lurked there too, one of them catching a close-up of my hollow eyes and sleepless face. Later, that photo would plaster the news with the caption, "Black Widow Bride." Inside the courtroom, the ordeal moved quickly, almost perfunctory, as though the verdict had been written before I walked in. The prosecutor's voice was firm, insistent. I was dangerous, a flight risk, a woman who had attempted to murder her husband in cold blood. His words carried weight, each syllable anchoring me deeper into the role they had crafted for me. And me? I had no one to fight back for me. No lawyer I could trust, no money to hire one. Only a court-appointed defender who looked more like a nervous intern than a man ready to save a life. He stood beside me, stiff and awkward, nodding along to the prosecutor's cadence, as though agreeing rather than opposing. When the judge asked if he had objections, he mumbled something vague about the presumption of innocence, his tone devoid of conviction. It was a gesture, not a defense, and the futility of it hit me harder than the handcuffs. There was no one in that room standing for me. No one willing to shout that I was the victim, not the predator. My words, my truth, were drowned out before I even spoke. The judge's ruling came like a stone dropped into water, simple, heavy, irreversible. 2 months in pretrial detention, at minimum, while they prepared to try me. After that would come the trial itself, the sentence, the cell they already imagined for me. My body sagged as the gavel struck, sealing my fate for the moment. Back in the van, the city passed by in a blur of lights and movement, indifferent to my suffering. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, thinking not of escape, but of survival. Somehow, I had to endure long enough to find a way to prove I wasn't the monster they had made me. Through the van window, I watched people hurrying to work, couples holding hands, children tugging at their parents, all of them wrapped in the ordinary rhythm of their lives. Just 2 days ago, I had been one of them, moving through the world without fear, planning a future I believed in. Now that life was gone, and I was delivered into a place where time and humanity dissolved. At the detention center, they processed me like cargo. Searched, prodded, examined, my belongings logged and stripped away. They handed me a gray uniform that hung from my body like it belonged to someone else, shapeless and colorless, erasing who I had been. The cell was already occupied by 3 women when the door clanged open to admit me. Their eyes tracked me as I stepped inside, cautious, calculating. New arrivals broke the monotony here, and I wasn't just any arrival. I was the face from the headlines, the one they'd seen on the news feeds, whispered about in corridors. They knew my story, or at least the version the world had chosen to believe. One of them, A broad-shouldered woman with faded tattoos curling down her arms leaned back on her cot and asked the question I had been bracing for. Was it true that I had tried to poison my husband on our wedding night? Her tone wasn't cruel, just blunt, a test to see what I'd say. I shook my head, my voice low but steady, and told them no, that it had been him, that Nathan had tried to poison me and then twisted the story. They exchanged glances, unreadable, and didn't press further. Whether they believed me or not, they let it drop. They showed me to the bottom bunk against the wall, a thin mattress covered with coarse fabric, and laid out the rules in clipped voices. Wake-up calls, meals, lights out, the short exercise breaks in the yard. I nodded, listening, though none of it truly sank in. My mind was too heavy with the enormity of where I was, of how far I had fallen. The clang of the lock behind me had sealed me inside more than a room. It had sealed me inside the story Nathan had written for me, a story I wasn't sure I'd survive long enough to rewrite. That first night inside was the longest of my life. I lay on the narrow bunk staring into the dark, my body aching from the unforgiving mattress, ears straining against the chorus of snores from my cellmates, and the eerie sounds drifting down the corridor. Sleep never came. I kept replaying every moment, the restaurant, the poisoned glass, the chase across rooftops, asking myself how my life had collapsed into this nightmare in just 2 days. By morning, I felt hollow, my eyes burning with exhaustion, but routine gave me no reprieve. Wake up, breakfast, roll call. Then they herded us into a tiny concrete courtyard hemmed in by high walls for our hour of fresh air, guards watching us as if we were caged animals. After lunch, a guard appeared at the cell door and barked my name. For a moment, I thought it would be another interrogation, another round of questions designed to twist me into knots. Instead, they brought me to a meeting room, bare except for a table and 2 chairs. Waiting there wasn't the nervous boy from court, but a woman in her 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and the kind of presence that filled the room before she even spoke. She introduced herself as Elena Morozova, an attorney. She explained that she had followed my case in the news, and something about it didn't sit right with her. The details, the inconsistencies, it had made her curious enough to dig deeper. I stared at her, stunned, struggling to believe anyone might willingly step into this storm for me. When I asked who had hired her, she smiled faintly and shook her head. No one. For now she was working pro bono, she said, because sometimes the truth needed a voice, even when it couldn't pay for one. If down the line I wanted to formalize things, we could talk about money. For now, she just wanted to hear my side. So I told her everything. From the whirlwind courtship to the waiter's warning, from the phone I'd found to the rooftop chase, right down to my arrest in the park. She listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving mine, only pausing to ask small, precise questions that showed she was absorbing every detail. When I finally finished, the silence stretched. She leaned back, tapping a pen against her notebook, her gaze thoughtful, and then finally, she said the words I hadn't expected to hear from anyone. There are gaps in their story, things that don't add up. We need to check them. Elena leaned forward, her pen tapping softly against the paper as she outlined the first cracks in the story against me. "Why did Nathan recover so quickly?" she asked, her voice calm but cutting. "If the poison was strong enough to kill, he shouldn't have walked out of a hospital bed in less than a day. And why is he so certain it was you who slipped something into his glass? He didn't see it because it never happened. So where does his certainty come from?" Her words cut through the fog in my head like light through smoke. Questions I should have asked myself but hadn't dared. She told me she was willing to take my case, to build a defense where no one else had even tried, but she needed me to recall everything, every tiny detail of that evening. The restaurant's name, the precise time we arrived, the layout of the dining room, the staff I might have noticed, anyone who could be traced or questioned. I closed my eyes, forcing myself back into that night, to the flicker of candles, the clink of glass, the whisper that had saved me. And then it hit me like a jolt of electricity. Cameras. A place as exclusive as that restaurant wouldn't risk a corner without surveillance. Somewhere, on a hard drive or a cloud, there had to be footage. Nathan leaning over the table, his hand moving toward my glass. The waiter bending close to whisper, me swapping the stemware. The thought made my pulse quicken for the first time in days, because it was something real, something that could prove I wasn't the monster they painted me to be. When I told Elena, her eyes lit with urgency. She scribbled notes quickly, her jaw tight with focus. If the footage still exists, it could change everything, she said, her tone measured but carrying a spark of excitement. I'll file a request immediately, though we have to move fast. If Nathan's people haven't already destroyed it, the police may have buried it. For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt a thread of hope, fragile but alive, threading its way through the darkness. When the guard came to escort me back to the cell, Elena squeezed my hand lightly and promised she'd return in a day or two with news. It was the first time in what felt like forever that I had something resembling hope. Back in the cell, that fragile spark warmed me. Someone believed me. Someone was willing to fight for me. Even my cellmates noticed, their eyes curious as they asked what had happened. I told them about the new lawyer, about the possibility of proving my innocence through the restaurant cameras. For the first time since arriving, they didn't look at me like I was insane. They looked like they wanted to believe. That evening, during dinner, the cell door creaked open and a guard called my name. Visitor! My pulse jumped. Who would come to see me here? My mother, maybe, though she thought I was losing my mind. Melissa? The thought made my stomach turn. I couldn't imagine looking her in the eye after what I had discovered. I followed the guard down a hallway into a narrow room divided by thick glass. A chair on each side, telephones mounted on the wall, the cliché of every prison movie. Suddenly, my reality. I sat, the plastic seat cold beneath me, and froze when I saw who stepped into the opposite chair. Nathan, my husband, my would-be killer, the man who had tried to poison me and then painted me as the monster. He moved with that same cultivated grace, dressed in a tailored suit, his hair perfect, his smile polished and confident. He looked every bit the picture of success and respectability. And he looked completely healthy, not a trace of weakness, not a shadow of the man who had clutched his chest and collapsed on our wedding night. He leaned forward, picked up the phone, and gave me that charming smile he used to disarm strangers, the one that had once made me fall for him. In that moment, my stomach turned to stone. I wanted to stand up, to walk away, to refuse to hear a word. But I couldn't move. I was trapped in that chair, staring at the man who had destroyed my life, wondering what game he wanted to play next. I didn't want to look at him, didn't want to hear the voice that had once been the soundtrack of my dreams and was now the echo of my nightmares. But I couldn't bring myself to hang up. Maybe it was the hope of catching him off guard, of hearing something slip that would prove what he had done. Maybe it was the simple paralysis of seeing him there, close enough to touch if not for the glass between us. My hand trembled as I lifted the phone, pressing it to my ear, my heart pounding with every second of silence before his voice filled the line. He smiled, that familiar, carefully constructed smile that had once seemed warm and safe. Now I saw the calculation behind it, the emptiness. His tone was calm, almost soothing, as though he were speaking to someone fragile. He told me he understood my condition, that he harbored no anger, that he wanted only to help me. If I confessed, if I admitted everything and agreed to treatment in a psychiatric clinic, he promised I would be cared for. His words dripped with feigned compassion, each one twisting the knife deeper, trying to rewrite me into his narrative. I listened in silence, my knuckles white as I clutched the phone. He spoke of instability, of how he had noticed changes in me before the wedding, how he had worried, but believed love could mend anything, how shocked he had been when he realized I had tried to poison him. His voice was steady, rehearsed, his performance flawless. He was building his case even here, in this sterile little room, turning me into the villain while painting himself as the patient, wounded husband. Then came the words that almost broke me, because once they would have meant everything. I still love you, Claire. The softness in his voice was a dagger wrapped in silk. Once, I would have melted into it. Now, it only made my skin crawl. I stared at him through the glass, forcing myself not to look away, and for the first time I felt the power shift, because I could finally see the mask, and I knew the man behind it had no love in him at all. "I want to help you," he said, his voice dripping with false tenderness. "All you have to do is admit it, and we'll find a good clinic. A few months of treatment, and you'll be free. We can start over." I stayed silent, my fingers tightening around the phone until my knuckles burned. I studied him through the glass, memorizing the angles of his face, the gleam in his eyes, the mask that I had once mistaken for love. How could I have missed it all before? How could I have given my heart to this predator? The silence unnerved him. His smile faltered, stiffened. The warmth in his eyes turned to something glacial. "You don't understand your position, Claire," he hissed, the threat now naked in his tone. "You have no way out. Every piece of evidence points to you. Every witness is on my side. Even your own mother believes you've lost your mind." My chest tightened, but I refused to look away. My silence was the only weapon I had, and it was beginning to rattle him. When he leaned forward, his voice dropped, dripping with malice. "Your shiny new lawyer? She won't help you. I know everything, Claire." My breath caught. How did he know about Elena? He smirked, savoring the flicker of fear in my eyes. "The restaurant footage you're counting on? Gone. Technical difficulties, isn't that convenient? The waiter who supposedly warned you? He's long gone, well compensated, far out of reach. No one will ever find him." His tone swelled with satisfaction, the predator savoring the corner he thought he had pushed me into. The facade of the wounded husband had disintegrated. What sat across from me was pure cruelty, a man who thrived on control and destruction. "So here are your choices," he said, his voice low, deliberate, relishing each word. "Option 1, you confess, agree to psychiatric evaluation, they declare you unstable, and you disappear into treatment. A year, maybe 2, and you walk out, free to live whatever life you have left. Option 2, you keep up this lie, you go to trial, and you spend 10 years in prison for attempted murder. 10 years, Claire." He smiled again, not warm, but sharp as a blade. "Choose," he said, leaning back in his chair like a man dictating the rules of a game he'd already won. My voice finally broke free, trembling but steady enough to cut through the silence. I asked him why. Why marry me if his plan had always been my death? Why go through the vows, the dance, the charade? For the first time, he didn't even bother to disguise the truth. A smirk tugged at his lips as he murmured, 5 million rubles, Claire. Your life insurance. Not a bad payout, right? And you're not the first. You won't be the last." The words hit me like ice water, cold and paralyzing. He wasn't bluffing, he wasn't taunting, he was confessing, calmly, carelessly, as though we were discussing the weather, my breath caught in my throat, my fingers trembling against the phone receiver. In that sterile room, under the harsh fluorescent lights, he admitted to the murders of women who had trusted him just as I had. He admitted to planning mine, and he did it with the arrogance of someone convinced no power on earth could touch him. His eyes narrowed, voice lowering to a venomous whisper that still carried through the glass. "You'll never get out of here, Claire. I have the money, the friends, the reach, and you have nothing." The certainty in his tone was suffocating, meant to crush me beneath its weight. He wanted me broken, compliant, desperate enough to surrender to his version of the truth. But even as my chest constricted and fear coiled tighter, another realization sparked beneath it. I had just been handed the one thing I hadn't had before, his own words. I forced myself to meet his gaze, holding steady even as every instinct screamed to look away. He thought he had locked me into a corner, but what he didn't know was that every syllable of his confession was now carved into my memory, unshakable and precise. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, I felt something shift inside me. He believed he had stripped me of everything, but he had just given me the one thing I needed most, proof, if I could find a way to make the world hear it. I didn't smile, didn't speak, only stared back at him, and in the silence between us, I felt the balance tilt ever so slightly. His words echoed long after he was gone, the click of the door sealing them into me like a brand. No one will believe you. No one will dig into this for a crazy woman. I had looked into his eyes and seen it clearly at last, not the man I had once thought I loved, but a predator, cold and deliberate, who saw people as numbers and lives as payouts. To him, I had never been a wife or a partner. I was a policy, a profit, a countdown to a payday. He told me to think about his offer, that I had a week to decide between a psychiatric ward or prison. Then he left, without even a backward glance, as if I were already buried. I sat there gripping the phone so tightly my hand went numb. Fear flooded me, but beneath it, burning hotter than anything else, came rage, pure, unfiltered rage. He wasn't just trying to kill me, he had murdered before, and he was already plotting the next. And he believed, with every fiber of his being, that the world would protect him, that money and influence would keep his hands clean while women like me were erased. For the first time, I felt something shift. If the system was stacked against me, then I had to find a way to fight outside of it. Back in the cell, the guard didn't ask questions, and neither did the women. They saw my face, the storm etched there, and wisely kept their distance. I lay on the hard bunk, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying his confession over and over. The footage is gone. The waiter is gone. The evidence is gone. He thought he had closed every door, but he didn't know the one thing that could still expose him. He didn't know that his arrogance had left me a weapon more dangerous than any document. Because I remembered every word, every smirk, every threat, every casual admission. His own voice was now etched into my memory, and if I could find a way to preserve it, to pass it on, it would become the proof he thought he had destroyed. He had given me 7 days, but what he didn't realize was that it wasn't for me to decide, it was for me to act. The clock was ticking, and I couldn't afford despair anymore. All I had left was fury, and fury could be enough to keep me alive. I carried the names like secret talismans: Elena, Anna, Irina. I had seen them in his phone, their documents, their deaths reduced to lines on a screen. They weren't just shadows of his past, they were the proof of his pattern. If Elena could trace their stories, if she could dig up the circumstances of their deaths, the insurance payouts, the coincidences too neat to ignore, then maybe, just maybe, we could unravel the mask Nathan had built around himself. The next day, when she came back, I poured everything out. The visit, the threats, the smug way he confessed, daring me to survive it. She listened intently, her pen scratching notes, her eyes narrowing not with doubt, but with focus. When I finished, she exhaled slowly and shared her own findings, and they hit me like a weight in the chest. The security footage? Gone, erased under the convenient excuse of a system failure. The waiter? Vanished, resigned suddenly, no forwarding address, no one who knew where he had gone. It was exactly as Nathan had promised, his reach sweeping every trail clean before I could even take a step. For a moment, despair threatened to swallow me whole again, but when I spoke of the wives, of the files I had seen, of the way their deaths had been written off as accidents, Elena leaned forward, her eyes alight with a new kind of fire. "That's where we start," she said quietly, and for the first time I felt she believed she had found a crack in his armor. This wasn't about one poisoned glass in a restaurant. It was about a pattern, a chain of women erased, each linked by his name and his profit. She promised to dig into the records, to find the marriages, the insurance policies, the investigations that had been buried. Her words steadied me. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the weight of his power lift just slightly, replaced by the possibility that the truth might claw its way into the light. If we could prove that he had done it before, then the story wouldn't just be about me, the Black Widow bride. It would be about him, the man who had hunted his wives like prey, the man who had built a life out of their deaths. And if we could prove that, then maybe the world would finally listen. When Elena left that day, I felt something I hadn't in weeks, a strange, fragile calm. My situation was still desperate, my name still dragged through the mud, the evidence still carefully erased by Nathan's hand. But now there was a plan a thread to hold on to. We could show the pattern, expose him not just as a betrayed husband, but as a predator who had left a trail of wives behind. For the first time, the weight on my chest eased, and when I lay down in my bunk that night, I slept, really slept, without jolting awake, without the suffocating press of nightmares. My body gave in, restoring itself for the battle ahead. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of waiting, meals, roll calls, head counts, the hour in the yard under the watchful eyes of guards. I learned the creaks and groans of the cell block, the way voices carried at night, the little rituals that made life inside bearable. Most of all, I learned to live with the 3 women who shared that narrow space with me. What had started as suspicion and distance began to soften, their eyes no longer searching for cracks in me, but accepting me as just another prisoner caught in the system's net. Larissa, the broad woman with the tattoos, was the first to speak openly. Her voice was gravelly, almost resigned, when she told me her story. Years of beatings from a husband who thought of her as a punching bag, years of silence she swallowed until the night he raised a hand against their daughter. That was the night she swung a frying pan, and when she saw him fall, there was no undoing it. Too hard, too final. She spoke of it without pride, but without regret either, as if prison was the price she had chosen to pay to save her child. Katya was the opposite, barely more than a girl, with nervous eyes that darted everywhere, as if still searching for a way out. She swore she didn't know what was in the bag her boyfriend had asked her to deliver, that she thought it was just clothes. Instead, it was filled with drugs, and now she faced years for trafficking. She told the story like someone trying to convince herself as much as others, her voice quivering, her hands twisting in her lap. Listening to them, I felt something shift inside me. Even here, in this cage, every woman carried her own story, her own truth warped by circumstance, and I realized that mine wasn't the only one the world had refused to believe. Nina, the 3rd woman in our cell, carried herself with the tired dignity of someone who had lived too long in the shadows of her own choices. She told me she had been a bookkeeper, clever with numbers, until desperation drove her to forge documents and siphon money into false accounts. Not for luxuries, not for greed, she said, but for her mother, who needed an operation she couldn't afford. As she spoke, I realized how complicated truth could be. Everyone here had their version, their justification, their line they told themselves to make sense of the walls closing in. Some were guilty, some victims of circumstance, some a mix of both. And I couldn't help asking myself, who was I in all of this? A victim, yes, but of what? Of love, of blindness, of trust misplaced in the hands of a man who had carved his life out of death? I refused to let that be the ending of my story. I would not be remembered as another tragedy on his list. For days I held that thought close, waiting, counting time by the clatter of meal trays and the clang of the lock on our cell. On the 5th day, the sound I had been longing for came, the guard calling my name, the familiar shuffle down the corridor, the door opening into the visitation room. Elena was there, papers stacked neatly before her, her expression grave but sharpened with purpose. She had found them. The marriages, the deaths, the payouts. Everything I had told her wasn't paranoia or invention. It was real, documented, archived in the files of a system too willing to look away. 3 wives, 3 sudden deaths, 3 financial windfalls for Nathan. She slid the copies across the table for me to see. Marriage certificates, death certificates, insurance policies. On the surface, they looked clean, routine, wrapped in the legality of signatures and stamps. But as Elena's pen tapped against the documents, she explained that patterns lived in the margins. Accidents too convenient, timelines too precise, investigations too shallow. On paper, it's all legitimate, she said, her eyes locking with mine. But if we dig deeper, we'll find the cracks. And those cracks might be what saves you. For the first time, I believed that the truth had a chance of clawing its way into daylight. Elena laid the papers out in front of me, her voice steady as she walked me through each story. The first wife, also named Elena, had died just 4 months after the wedding. A car accident on a mountain road during their vacation in Crimea, except Nathan had stepped out of the car minutes before it happened, supposedly to take pictures of the view. He walked away without a scratch. The insurance company paid out 3 million rubles. On paper, it was a tragedy. To me, it looked like the start of a pattern. The second wife, Anna, fell from the balcony of their ninth-floor apartment barely 3 months into the marriage. Nathan was at work with colleagues to vouch for him, and the case was closed quickly as an accident. They said she leaned too far over the railing, trying to rescue a fallen flower pot. 4 million rubles followed. I stared at the document, at the neat stamps and signatures, and felt my skin crawl. It was as if death shadowed every vow he made, and the payouts only grew. The third wife, Irina, didn't last 5 months. She drowned during their honeymoon in the Maldives. He told the authorities he had gone to the bar for drinks, and by the time he returned, she was already gone. Witnesses confirmed they saw him rush into the water, too late to save her. He walked away with 4.5 million rubles and the image of a grieving widower. And then there was me, the fourth, insured for 5 million, the most valuable tragedy of all. Seeing it spelled out in numbers and names made my stomach twist. I wasn't paranoid. I was next on the list. Elena looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. "It's not enough to charge him," she admitted quietly. "Every file is closed, every death ruled accidental, every alibi airtight. But together, these cases show a pattern too sharp to ignore. It's enough to challenge how they're treating you now, enough to make them reconsider locking you away without a trial." She told me she had already filed a motion to review my detention, attaching the documents as supporting evidence. For the first time, it felt like Nathan's perfect facade had a crack wide enough for the light to slip through. Waiting was its own kind of torture. Every morning I woke with the same fragile hope that today would bring news, and every evening I lay back down with the crushing weight of disappointment. The walls of the cell seemed to press closer with each passing day, time stretching and snapping like an elastic band. And then at last, Elena appeared again, her face composed, but her eyes carrying that glimmer I had been desperate to see. She told me the court had agreed to a hearing. Tomorrow. My pulse quickened at the word. Tomorrow. She laid out the plan with precision, the documents, the patterns, the argument we would build together. I clung to every word, trying to breathe strength from her certainty. That night, I didn't sleep. I rolled restlessly on the hard cot, my mind running through every possible version of what was to come, standing before the judge, trying to keep my voice steady, meeting Nathan's gaze if he was there, wondering whether truth had any chance against his money and lies. It was the longest night of my life, stretching into eternity, each hour another reminder of what was at stake. In the morning, they shackled me and loaded me into the van. The flashbulbs greeted me before I even stepped inside the courthouse, the journalists calling out questions that stabbed like needles. Why had I tried to kill my husband? When had I planned it? How did it feel to be caught? But this time, I didn't drop my head or hide behind my hair. I walked forward with my chin lifted, my eyes steady. I wasn't the broken woman they wanted to capture. I wasn't the caricature in their headlines. I was fighting, and I wanted the world to see it. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy, buzzing with the presence of reporters, curious onlookers, and the quiet hum of power. And there he was, Nathan, in the front row, his face arranged into perfect sorrow, the grieving husband, the betrayed man. He played his role flawlessly, even dabbing at his eyes with a folded handkerchief. For a second, a wave of nausea rose in me, the sheer obscenity of his performance threatening to knock me off balance. But I gripped the edge of the table, anchored myself, and reminded myself why I was there. Not just to save my name, to save the women who could come after me if I failed. Marina sat beside him, the woman I once called my closest friend, her eyes fixed anywhere but on me. The sight of her there, aligned so neatly with him, cut deeper than any insult could. The hearing began with the prosecutor reciting his accusations in a tone that made me feel less like a person and more like a headline: dangerous, unstable, guilty by default. He insisted I remain behind bars, painting me as a manipulator capable of anything. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay still, to wait for Elena's turn. When she rose, her voice carried through the courtroom with clarity that sliced through the fog of accusation. Calm, precise, she laid out the documents one by one, each piece another crack in Nathan's polished image. 3 wives before me, 3 tragic deaths, 3 large insurance payouts that had grown with each marriage. She highlighted the impossible neatness of his alibis, the way tragedy seemed to orbit him while he always walked away untouched, wealthier each time. The courtroom shifted, whispers rustling like dry leaves as the picture began to form. She didn't stop there. Elena pressed on, pointing to the restaurant surveillance system that mysteriously failed the very night I was accused, to the waiter who had disappeared into thin air the next morning. "Coincidence?" she asked, her eyes flashing toward the bench. Then she cut into the core: Nathan's certainty. How could he know I poisoned his glass if he hadn't seen me do it? And why did he recover so quickly from a supposedly lethal dose? Each question hung heavy in the air, unanswered, unsettling. I watched him as she spoke, unable to look anywhere else. At first his face wore the same calm mask he had perfected, the sorrowful survivor. But as her words carved deeper, that mask faltered. A twitch at his mouth, a tightening of his jaw, the faintest sheen of sweat along his hairline. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anyone to reach back into his past and drag his ghosts into the light. For the first time, I saw something that looked like fear flicker across his features. When Elena finally sat down, the judge called for a recess to deliberate, and the tension in the room was a living thing. They led me and Elena into a separate room while the judge deliberated, and though she kept her tone measured, I caught the spark in her eyes. She told me the judge had listened closely, had scribbled notes through her entire statement, and that alone gave us reason to hope. But she warned me not to count on anything. Nathan had money, he had influence, and he knew how to pull strings behind closed doors. I clung to her words anyway, repeating them in my head like a prayer. For the first time in weeks, hope didn't feel like a betrayal. An hour passed before they brought us back into the courtroom, and my pulse roared so loudly I could barely hear the judge's first words. But then the sentence reached me: home arrest. Not prison, not a cell. I would be allowed to leave the detention center and live in my old apartment, the one I'd planned to rent after the wedding. There would be conditions, of course: an ankle monitor, no internet, no phone, but it was freedom compared to the suffocating walls I'd been trapped behind. For a moment, I thought I had misheard, that my mind had created the words I so desperately wanted. I turned to Elena and saw her smile, faint but real, the first time she had allowed herself to celebrate in front of me. Then I let my gaze slide across the courtroom to Nathan. His face was drained of color, his jaw set tight, his eyes locked on mine with a fury so sharp it could have cut glass. And there, beside him, Marina shifted, uncomfortably, her eyes sliding away when she realized I was staring. That was when I understood. They were losing control, and they knew it. His glare carried a silent vow of retribution, but instead of fear, I felt something else rise in me: defiance. Back in the detention center, they processed my release with clinical precision. Signatures, forms, the metallic click of the ankle bracelet locking into place. I should have felt humiliated, shackled by another symbol of control. But as the guard explained the rules of my confinement, all I felt was relief. I was going home, not to him, not to the lie of our marriage, but to the one place still mine. And from there, I would fight. The war wasn't over, not even close. But for the first time, I was stepping onto ground that felt like my own. Larissa's hug stayed with me long after I walked out of that cell block. Awkward, stiff, but genuine. The kind of embrace that said, "I see you, I believe you." Her words, raw and sharp, echoed too: "Don't let that bastard win." The hours that followed crawled under the weight of paperwork and signatures, guards reciting rules about the bracelet locked around my ankle. By the time they handed me back the jeans and t-shirt I had been arrested in, I could barely breathe. They smelled like the air outside, like freedom, and I clutched them to me as if they were armor. And then there was Elena, exactly where she promised to be, waiting at the gates with her car. The moment I slid into the seat, I felt the first true rush of relief. She drove steadily, her voice calm but full of intent as she outlined our plan. Petition for the charges to be dropped, hunt down the missing waiter, gather every shred of evidence that tied Nathan to his trail of wives. Each word she spoke stitched resolve deeper into me. I wasn't drifting anymore. I had direction, I had purpose, I had an ally. The city rolled by outside the window, familiar streets that felt both strange and comforting. When we pulled up to my old apartment building, my stomach tightened at the sight that awaited us. A cluster of reporters stood by the entrance, their cameras already raised, microphones in hand. They must have been tipped off about the judge's decision, eager to turn my first steps into another headline. Elena leaned toward me, her voice low and steady, telling me I didn't owe them anything. That silence was my right. But silence was no longer enough. I had been silenced too long, painted into someone else's story as the villain, the lunatic, the Black Widow. I wanted my voice to cut through the noise, even if only for a moment. I straightened my back, opened the car door, and stepped out into the crush of lights and questions. My heart pounded, my throat dry, but I knew exactly what I needed to say. Not for them, not even for Nathan, but for myself. It was time to speak, to reclaim the story he had stolen. The crowd surged the moment I stepped out, their voices clashing in a storm of questions, microphones pressed toward my face. For a heartbeat, I thought about running inside, hiding until the noise passed. But instead, I lifted my hand, and to my surprise, the chaos dimmed. Flashbulbs still burst around me, but the questions stilled enough for my voice to find its way through. I spoke calmly, my words deliberate, steady, as if each one was a stone I was laying down to build a path back to myself. I told them about that night in the restaurant, how Nathan had insisted I drink the wine, how the waiter whispered his warning, how I switched the glasses and watched the poison find its way to the wrong lips. I told them about the files I'd uncovered, about his wives before me, women erased by accidents that were too clean, too convenient. I said I wasn't the monster they had been writing about, that I was the one who had been marked for death, and that I refused to stay silent any longer. The cameras captured it all, their red lights blinking like eyes that finally saw me. I knew the risks. Nathan would call it slander. His lawyers would draft threats before the evening was over, and the machine of his influence would grind into motion. But standing there, my voice carrying over the hush of the crowd, I felt stronger than I had since this nightmare began. For once, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. Speaking the truth aloud was its own kind of freedom, even if it came with consequences. When I turned toward the entrance, Elena was just behind me, her expression proud, almost fierce. She didn't need to say a word. I could see she understood what I had done. I hadn't just stepped back into my apartment. I had declared war on my own terms, in front of the entire country. The cameras would replay my words, dissect them, doubt them, but they were out there now, and they couldn't be erased. And for the first time, I believed that the truth, however fragile, might just survive. When I closed the door behind me, a strange wave washed over me, something I hadn't felt in weeks. Home. My old apartment smelled faintly of dust and lavender, the way it always had. The shelves still held my books in the same crooked rows. The frames on the wall still displayed snapshots of a life I once thought was ordinary and safe. This was the one space Nathan had never touched, the one piece of my world he hadn't corrupted. For the first time since that dinner, I could breathe without fear of who might be waiting around the corner. Elena moved around briskly, showing me how the ankle monitor worked, reminding me of the rules. Stay inside, no visitors except her, no phone, no internet. My radius was no larger than these 4 walls, and stepping outside would send me straight back into a cell. The restrictions were suffocating on paper, but compared to iron bars and fluorescent lights, it felt like liberation. Before she left, she shared a sliver of hope. she had found the address of the waiter's mother. If we could reach him, maybe the story I told wouldn't just be words echoing in an empty room. When the door clicked shut behind her, silence settled over me like a heavy quilt. For days, I had been chased by footsteps, sirens, shouting voices. Now there was nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythm of my own breath. I sat on the couch, letting the quiet press in, my body loosening for the first time in what felt like forever. I wasn't running. I wasn't locked away. I was here, in my space, with my thoughts, terrifying and comforting all at once. Out of habit, I reached for the remote. The television was my only allowed window to the world, and when the screen flickered on, I nearly dropped it. My own face stared back at me. Footage of me outside the courthouse, my words clear and defiant, looping on every channel. Then came Nathan's image, polished and poised, offering his version into the same swarm of microphones. His voice carried that familiar mix of sorrow and poison, and as I watched, I realized the battle had already spilled far beyond the courtroom. It was now playing out in living rooms across the country. On the screen, Nathan wore his mask flawlessly, creased brows, rehearsed sorrow, a careful tremor in his voice as he spoke about my fragility, about how much he worried for me, about how he only wanted me to get the psychiatric help I so clearly needed. To anyone else, it might have sounded convincing, but I knew better. His words were bait, his smile a weapon, and underneath it all, his eyes betrayed him. There was a flicker there, sharp and unmistakable. Fear. For the first time, he wasn't entirely in control of the story, and he knew it. That glimpse of panic in him was enough to steady me. It reminded me why I had to keep pushing, why I couldn't let exhaustion or despair take me under. He had silenced women before me, erased their lives with staged tragedies and bloodless lies, but I was still here, still breathing, still fighting. The road ahead would be brutal. He had money, lawyers, friends in the right places, and I had nothing but Elena and the truth. But for the first time, that felt like it could be enough. The apartment itself became both comfort and cage. My bed, my kitchen, my books. They were small luxuries I hadn't dared hope for after the iron bars of the detention center. I could make tea, curl beneath my own blanket, feel like a human being again. Yet every step I took carried the reminder strapped around my ankle. The bracelet was cold, heavy, a constant whisper. You are still a prisoner. At night, when I lay awake, I would trace its edges with my fingertips, half in shame, half in defiance, promising myself it wasn't forever. Elena's daily visits became my lifeline. She came with groceries, with case updates, with a steadiness that filled the cracks inside me. Sometimes we spoke for hours, going over every detail, every possible lead. Sometimes she simply sat across from me, her presence proof that I wasn't as alone as I felt. Each time she left, the silence pressed in again, but it no longer felt suffocating. It felt like preparation, like gathering breath before diving into deep water. I was still trapped, yes, but I was also waiting, sharpening, readying myself for the fight of my life. That evening, Elena arrived with a fire in her eyes I hadn't seen before, her movements brisk, her words tumbling out faster than usual. She had tracked down the mother of the waiter, the only man who had stepped into my nightmare to warn me. The woman lived in a crumbling apartment on the edge of the city, cautious and tight-lipped, terrified of saying the wrong thing. At first, she refused to let Elena in, certain that speaking would endanger her son. But slowly, through patience and gentle persistence, Elena managed to open the door not just to her home, but to her story. The mother described the night that had turned her son's life upside down. How he had called in the early hours, his voice trembling with panic, insisting he had to disappear immediately. He gave no details, no names, but she had never heard such raw fear in him before. Since then, he phoned her from different numbers, never staying on the line long, never revealing his location. Each call was short, coded almost, as if the walls around her could listen. He trusted no one, not even himself enough to share where he was hiding. Elena had asked the mother to reach out on our behalf, to tell him there was someone willing to fight beside him, that his truth might save an innocent woman from prison, that we weren't looking to expose him to danger, only to shine a light on what he had already seen. The old woman hesitated, twisting her hands, torn between protecting her son and helping a stranger. In the end, with tears in her eyes, she agreed to pass along the message if he called again, but she warned Elena that he might refuse, that fear might keep him silent forever. When Elena finished recounting all of this in my apartment, her words sank into me like water on parched soil. It wasn't a promise, not even close to certainty, but it was something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in days. Possibility. Somewhere out there was a man who could tell the truth, who had seen what everyone else pretended not to see. Maybe he would never come forward. Maybe Nathan's shadow was too long. But knowing he was alive, knowing he was still out there, gave me a thread to hold on to. And sometimes a single thread is all it takes to keep from unraveling completely. The next morning, the apartment felt charged, like the air before a storm. Elena set up her laptop on my kitchen table, her fingers moving quickly over the keys as she explained the connection would be secure, that his location would stay hidden. I nodded, though my hands trembled against the mug of tea I hadn't touched. It felt surreal. After weeks of running, hiding, doubting my own sanity, here I was, waiting for a stranger's face to appear on a screen, a stranger who might hold the key to saving me. When the call finally connected, I held my breath. The image was grainy at first, then cleared to reveal a pale young man with dark circles under his eyes. He couldn't have been older than 25, but fear had carved lines across his face that made him seem twice that. Behind him were heavy curtains drawn tight, the kind that belong to cheap hotels or roadside motels, places where people pay cash and don't leave names. He didn't bother with small talk or even a greeting. His voice cracked slightly as he began, but his eyes were steady. "I saw him," he said, and even through the screen those words landed like a strike to my chest. He described how Nathan had slipped a small vial from his jacket, how he poured its contents into the left glass while I was away from the table, how quickly and confidently he moved as though he had rehearsed it 100 times. He admitted he hesitated to intervene, terrified of losing his job, until guilt got the better of him, and he whispered that warning to me. He looked down as he spoke, ashamed, but when he lifted his gaze again, I saw not shame, just terror. He told us Nathan had found him the next morning, cornered him outside his apartment, his threats quiet but deadly clear. "Leave the city, disappear, or your mother will pay the price." That was why he had run, why he was still running. His hands shook as he spoke, but he kept going, determined to get the truth out, at last. Watching him, I felt a knot loosen inside me. For the first time since this nightmare began, it wasn't just my word against Nathan's. Someone else had seen. Someone else knew. Andre's words spilled out quickly, as if he had been holding them inside too long, and each one carved deeper into the truth I already knew in my bones. He described how Nathan had slipped the vial from his jacket while my chair was empty, how his hand moved with such practiced ease it couldn't have been the first time. A couple drops, no more, into the glass on the left. A flick of his wrist. The bottle vanished back into the fabric. It had taken only seconds, but Andre had seen everything. He admitted he didn't know what the liquid was. Poison, medicine, something else. But what froze him was the look on Nathan's face, the way he checked the room before doing it, the secrecy coiled in every movement. It was enough to spark suspicion, enough to leave Andre sick with unease. That was why, when I came back, he leaned in just enough to murmur those words that saved me. "Don't drink from the left glass." He had no idea whether I'd listen, whether I'd even understand, but he couldn't walk away without trying. Through the screen, he confessed he had seen me switch the glasses, seen Nathan lift the poisoned one to his lips, seen the first wave of discomfort spread across his face. Andre's voice shook as he said it, because that was the moment he realized what he had stumbled into, that he had witnessed an attempted murder and accidentally stopped it. The chaos that followed, the ambulance, the shouting guests, the clatter of dishes, It was all burned into his mind. And yet the sharpest memory was the fear that Nathan had caught the glance between us, that Nathan knew he had interfered. So when his shift ended, he didn't go home. He packed a bag, emptied his locker, and disappeared before dawn. He couldn't take the risk of staying, not with Nathan's eyes and money hunting him down. Watching him recount it, I felt a surge of something I hadn't let myself feel in weeks: relief. At last, someone else carried this truth with me. It wasn't just my voice screaming into the void anymore. There was another witness, another heartbeat, another human being willing to say, "She is not lying. She was never lying. He was never." Andre's voice dropped lower as he spoke of what came after that night, the part no one else could have guessed. He hadn't walked into the restaurant again, hadn't even stopped to collect his final paycheck. Instead, he lied to his manager over the phone about a family emergency, hoping it would end there. But the very next day, a stranger called. No name, no explanation, just a calm warning delivered in a tone so chilling it cut right through him. They knew what he had seen. They knew what he had said, and if he ever spoke of it again, he wouldn't live to regret it. The fear was enough to drive him underground. He changed his number, packed what little he had, and moved to a small town hours away. Found work at a dingy cafe, paid in cash, kept his head down. He lived like a ghost, always glancing over his shoulder, flinching whenever the door opened, waiting for the shadow of Nathan's reach to fall across his life. That was why he resisted at first when his mother told him about us, about my case, about the woman accused of trying to poison her husband. He didn't want to be dragged back into the nightmare. But when he finally opened the news articles and saw my name, saw my face, saw the words "Black Widow" splashed beside it, something in him broke. He knew I wasn't the villain they painted me to be. He knew because he had watched the real villain's hand drop poison into my glass. He said he couldn't stand by and let me rot in a cell while Nathan walked free, hunting for his next wife, his next payout. His voice cracked as he admitted it terrified him, but his conscience wouldn't let him stay silent. Elena leaned forward then, asking softly if he would be willing to do more than this call. Could he record a sworn video statement, something admissible in court, something that couldn't be twisted by Nathan's lawyers? Maybe, one day soon, even stand before a judge in person. For a moment the silence was heavy, his fear and our hope hanging in the balance. Then Andre nodded, barely at first, but enough. "If it means saving her," he said, glancing at me through the screen, "I'll do it." And in that instant, for the first time in months, I believed that maybe, just maybe, I had a fighting chance. Andre hesitated, his eyes flickering to the corners of the screen like someone expecting danger to burst in at any moment. But finally, he agreed. Not to return, never that, but to speak here and now, to let the camera catch every word. Elena pressed the button, and his voice filled the room, trembling at first, then steadier as he described what he had seen, how Nathan leaned over my glass, how I returned unaware, how he whispered the warning that saved me. He recounted his escape, the threats that followed, the months spent hiding like a fugitive though he had done nothing wrong. His hands shook as he spoke, but the truth was unshakable. When the recording ended, Elena thanked him, her tone firm, professional, but I could hear the relief beneath it. She told him plainly that his testimony could mean the difference between my freedom and a prison sentence, that it could force the court to look at Nathan differently. Andre nodded, though his expression was grim. Fear still sat heavy on him, like a shadow he could never outrun. He knew exactly how far Nathan's influence stretched, and even through the screen, his fear bled into me, reminding me of the monster I had married. Just as Elena reached to close the session, Andre spoke again, almost as if the thought had been gnawing at him the whole time. He said that night wasn't the first. Months earlier, he had served Nathan at the very same restaurant, only then Nathan hadn't been with me. He had been with another woman, and Andre swore he saw the same furtive movement, the same vial, the same careful drop into her glass while she was away from the table. At the time, he dismissed it, told himself it was none of his business, maybe medicine, maybe nothing at all. But now, replaying it, he realized what he might have witnessed. The air in my living room seemed to thicken as his words sank in. Another woman, another night, another attempt, perhaps one that had succeeded. My blood turned cold, not only because it confirmed Nathan's pattern, but because it showed how long he had been perfecting it, how many chances he had taken. I felt sick with dread, but also vindicated. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining his darkness. It was real. It had been happening long before me, and Andre's shaky voice had just cracked open the door to proving it. When the call ended, I sat frozen in my chair, his last words echoing louder than anything that came before. Another woman. Someone I had never heard of, who didn't fit the names or faces of Nathan's wives that I already knew. Short dark hair, timid voice, eyes that seemed too big for her delicate frame. Andre couldn't remember her name, but he remembered her silence, her smallness, her almost childlike caution. My stomach twisted as I wondered, was she alive now, living quietly somewhere, never realizing how close she had come to dying? Or had she already vanished into the shadows of Nathan's carefully staged tragedies? Elena and I sat for a long time afterward, talking in circles, trying to piece together what little we had. If Nathan had more marriages than the 3 we uncovered, it would mean his pattern stretched further than we imagined. Maybe the woman Andre described was another wife, maybe a fiancée, maybe just someone unlucky enough to sit across from him at dinner. The possibilities churned in my mind like poison. I couldn't stop picturing her face, built from scraps of description, and feeling the weight of every unanswered question pressing against my chest. Elena finally broke the silence with a plan. She would dig deeper, past the official documents, past the tidy records that painted Nathan as a grieving widower. She would look into marriage registries, court filings, even foreign records if she had to. Maybe there were annulments, secret marriages, names that never made it into the public sphere. And if there was no paperwork, she would track down witnesses, neighbors, friends, anyone who might recall Nathan with another woman. The thought that there could be others, wives erased, girlfriends forgotten, victims buried under the word accident, filled me with a kind of rage I didn't know I could feel. But alongside the fear, there was something else, hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had more than words, more than tears, more than my own frantic story. We had Andre's testimony on video, recorded in his own shaking voice, describing exactly what he saw. It wasn't everything. It wouldn't bring justice overnight, but it was a start, a crack in Nathan's perfect mask. Elena left that afternoon to bring the recording to the prosecutors, her eyes alight with a fire I hadn't seen before, and I stayed behind in my silent apartment, staring at the door, waiting for the news that might finally turn the tide. The hours dragged like years, each tick of the clock pressing on my chest, until I thought I would suffocate. I couldn't read, couldn't watch television, couldn't even sit still. I paced the apartment over and over, the bracelet on my ankle scratching against my skin, reminding me of my cage. I checked the time every few minutes, waiting, wishing, praying for news, until the silence became unbearable. When the doorbell finally rang, I nearly collapsed from the jolt of relief and terror all at once. Elena stood there, her face brighter than I'd ever seen it, and before she even spoke, I knew something had shifted. The prosecutors had accepted Andre's video. They opened a new investigation, this time against Nathan, officially labeling it an attempted murder case. They didn't clear my name yet. I was still under suspicion, but for the first time, the weight wasn't pressing entirely on my shoulders. For the first time, the fight wasn't just mine. And then Elena told me something that made my blood run cold and hot at the same time. She had found the woman Andre described. Her name was Natalia Sokolova, and she wasn't a stranger at all. She had once been Nathan's wife, his very first, the one no one mentioned. Their marriage lasted only 2 months before ending in divorce. No insurance policy, no sudden accident, no tragic death. Just a clean break, quietly filed away like it never mattered. Natalia was alive. She worked as a librarian at the university in our own city, living quietly, almost invisibly. A survivor hiding in plain sight. Why had she lived when all the others had died? What had gone wrong in Nathan's plan? As Elena spoke, I felt a strange mix of hope and dread building inside me. Natalia might hold the answers. She might be the key to unraveling Nathan's perfect web. And for the first time I realized I wasn't the only one who had looked into the eyes of the monster and escaped. I spent the whole night turning from side to side, staring into the dark, my mind circling around the same questions until they tangled into knots. Why had she survived when the others hadn't? What did she know about Nathan that I didn't? By the time morning light slipped through the blinds, I was hollow with exhaustion, but too wired to rest. When Elena arrived carrying her laptop, I felt as if my heart had been waiting at the door for her, beating too fast for too long. We set the computer on the coffee table in my small living room and waited in silence for the call to come through, every second stretching unbearably. When the screen finally lit up, all we saw was a black square. Natalia had turned on her camera but angled it away, hiding herself from us. And when she spoke, her voice was faint, almost breaking, like someone not used to speaking about the past. She began with suspicion, asking who we really were, what we wanted, and why we were dredging up a name she clearly wanted to bury. There was a tremor in her words, the sound of a woman who had carried fear for so long it had seeped into her bones. Elena answered her carefully, with the calm tone of someone who knows how to hold fragile trust. She explained my case, how I stood accused of trying to poison my own husband, how Nathan had painted me as unstable and dangerous, how a witness had already confirmed he was the one who tampered with the wine. She spoke not like a lawyer building an argument, but like a woman reaching out to another, showing her we were not enemies, that we needed her truth. I sat beside her, my palms damp against my knees, barely breathing, as if the wrong movement might scare Natalia back into silence. For a long time the only sound was static on the line, and I wondered if she would hang up, if the fear of Nathan was still stronger than any sense of justice. Then at last, Natalia spoke again, lower this time, each word weighted with hesitation. She said she remembered the way he looked at her, the way his charm turned sharp when he thought no one was watching. She admitted she had left him suddenly, without explaining to anyone why, because she knew if she stayed, something terrible would happen. She hadn't been ready to tell the world back then, but now, hearing what he had done to me, she said she couldn't keep quiet anymore. There was a long silence on the line, the kind that stretches so far you start to think the other person won't speak at all. Then, slowly, haltingly, Natalia began. She described meeting Nathan 5 years earlier, how quickly she had fallen under his spell, how the charm and attention felt like something out of a dream. Within weeks, he had proposed. Within 2 months, they were married, and she thought she had stepped into a life of security and love. He insisted on life insurance right after the wedding, told her it was standard for married couples, reassured her he had taken out one in her name as well. She hadn't questioned it. Why would she? He seemed so thoughtful, so responsible. But soon cracks began to show. He started insisting she drink vitamins every morning, a glass of water with some powder he prepared himself. She hated the taste, but forced it down, not wanting to disappoint him. After a few weeks, her body began to betray her. Constant dizziness, nausea, a weakness that left her struggling to get through the day. Doctors could find nothing concrete, told her it might be stress, maybe nerves, maybe her body adjusting to marriage and a new routine. But Natalia knew her own body, and something felt wrong, deeply wrong. Then came the dinner that haunted her ever since, the same restaurant where he later tried to poison me. Nathan had ordered wine with an odd flourish, telling her she simply had to try it. When she excused herself to the restroom and returned, she noticed her glass looked different, as if the liquid had been stirred, faintly cloudy in a way it hadn't been before. Alarm bells rang in her mind. She lifted the glass, let it touch her lips, but never swallowed. She pretended, feigned sips, while Nathan's eyes followed her every move, too intent, too insistent. His gentle mask slipped that night, just enough for her to see the sharp edges behind it. Afterward, back at home, he grew tense and irritable, snapping at small things, pacing, pressing her again about why she hadn't finished her wine. Natalia realized then she was in danger. The man she married wasn't just controlling, wasn't just secretive. He was watching her like a hunter watches prey. That night, she made a decision she never regretted. She began planning her escape. And though she never told anyone the full truth until now, the fear in her voice as she spoke made it clear. Nathan hadn't simply let her go. She had slipped through his fingers, and he had moved on to find another victim. Natalia's voice trembled as she described the first crack in the illusion, the night he raised his voice at her. It wasn't about anything important, just a trivial complaint, but it was the first time she felt the sharp edge of something darker beneath his charm. She told herself it was fatigue, a bad day at work, something ordinary. But the next morning, when Nathan handed her the same glass of vitamins, she decided she couldn't ignore the knot in her stomach anymore. She mimed drinking it, let the liquid touch her lips, then quietly poured it into a flower pot when he turned his back. Days later, the plant withered and died, its leaves curling in on themselves as if poisoned from the inside out. That, she whispered, was the moment everything changed. She realized the sickness eating away at her wasn't stress or nerves. It was her husband, feeding her death in careful doses, disguising murder as care. And when that wasn't fast enough for him, he escalated. He had tried to push her toward the wine that night in the restaurant, hovering, pressing, urging her to drink more, his eyes fixed on her every move. She understood then that she was prey in his carefully woven trap, and the man who vowed to love her was planning her slow erasure from the world. The thought alone was enough to shatter the last pieces of trust holding her in place. Natalia said she didn't confront him, didn't run to the police. She knew she had nothing but a dying flower and her own instincts, nothing that would stand against his money and his charm. Instead, she waited, pretending, collecting her strength until the first chance arrived. When Nathan left for work one morning, she gathered what little she could carry and walked out the door without looking back. She never returned, never answered his calls, never told anyone the truth, until now, speaking to us through the safety of a darkened screen. Natalia told us that once she slipped away, she never saw him again. She filed for divorce quietly through an attorney, refusing to meet Nathan face to face. To her shock, he didn't contest it, didn't fight for the marriage, didn't even try to argue. It was as if letting her go cost him nothing, as if it was easier to find someone new than to finish what he had started. She realized later that to him she was never a wife at all, just a failed investment, and he had simply moved on. After the papers were signed, she changed her last name, relocated to another part of the city, and started over. She kept her head down, worked a modest job, lived quietly, never telling anyone what had really happened. But even in that new life she carried the fear, a constant shadow following her through the years. Every unfamiliar face on the street, every knock at the door, every wrong number, she wondered if it was him, if Nathan had tracked her down to finish the job. When she saw the news about him remarrying, and later the reports about me being accused of poisoning him, she said her blood ran cold. She recognized the pattern instantly. It was the same routine he had used on her, only reversed. This time he had twisted the story, so the victim became the villain. The very crime he had planned laid at someone else's feet. She wanted to help, she admitted, wanted to come forward, but the old terror was stronger. She was terrified that if she stepped out of the shadows, he would know, he would find her, and she would pay for daring to speak. That's why she agreed to talk to us only like this, hidden behind a blank screen, her voice low, her identity shielded. And even so, her words were enough to send a chill through the room. Elena asked her if she would be willing to give an official statement, maybe even record a testimony the way Andre had, but Natalia faltered. She needed time, she said, to weigh the danger against the truth. When the call ended, Elena was still hopeful, because even if Natalia never spoke publicly, her story gave us exactly what we needed: a map of his pattern, proof of a scheme that had been working for years. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, trying to digest everything Natalia had shared. It was like looking in a mirror. Her story was my story. The same vitamins, the same poisoned wine, the same stage set for a perfect tragedy. The only difference was timing. She caught it early, trusted her instincts, and slipped away before the damage was done. I hadn't been that lucky, and now I was the one wearing an ankle monitor, branded a criminal in front of the entire city. When Elena came back later, her face carried the weight of fresh news. The prosecutors had agreed to reopen the past, to treat the deaths of Nathan's other wives not as accidents, but as possible murders. They filed motions to exhume the bodies for toxicology reports, a brutal but necessary step to uncover the truth. For the first time, the authorities weren't dismissing me as unstable. They were starting to see a pattern, a design too cruel to ignore. And then Elena told me the part that almost brought me to my knees. Natalia had called her back, just an hour after our meeting, her voice steadier this time. She had made her choice. Fear or not, she was done hiding. She was ready to testify, ready to tell prosecutors and judges what she told us. She wanted her story on record, wanted to expose the man who nearly erased her. I couldn't stop the tears when I heard it. I had spent so long thinking I was utterly alone in this nightmare, fighting a shadow no one else could see. But Natalia's decision changed that. I wasn't just one voice crying into the void anymore. I had an ally, a survivor who had lived through the same hell and was brave enough to speak. And that meant Nathan's carefully polished mask was finally starting to crack. When Elena told me that Natalia had agreed to testify in court if needed, I felt the air change around me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the women who never made it out, about the lives already stolen and the ones that would be if Nathan stayed free. Natalia's courage became the turning point. For the first time, I felt like the weight of truth wasn't balanced on my shoulders alone. Now, there were two of us speaking out, two witnesses ready to show the world who he really was. The prosecutors wasted no time. They summoned Nathan the very next morning, and though I wasn't in that interrogation room, I could picture it. His mask slipping as they pressed him with the video testimony from Andrew, with Natalia's words, with the questions about the wives who never lived long enough to see a first anniversary. Every detail of his carefully scripted life was now a weapon turned against him. The narrative he built was starting to crumble. When Elena returned that evening, I knew before she opened her mouth. There was triumph in her eyes. She told me Nathan had cracked, not confessed, not yet, but he was rattled. His answers contradicted one another, his calm composure fractured into visible panic. He denied, of course, but the veneer of confidence was gone. The man who once sat across from me in a restaurant, smiling as he planned my death, had been reduced to a cornered animal fighting for control. But a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. Elena warned me that this was the moment when he could lash out, desperate to regain power. He wasn't the polished businessman the world adored anymore. He was a predator exposed, stripped of his illusion of invincibility. That made him unpredictable. That made him lethal. And for the first time, I realized that survival wasn't just about proving my innocence in court. It was about staying alive long enough to see him finally fall. We all knew Nathan wouldn't go down quietly, but I don't think any of us were truly ready for how fast he would strike back. Elena arranged for extra police patrols around my building, and she even slept on my couch to make sure I was never left alone. I told myself these were just precautions, but deep down, I knew the truth. When a man like him feels cornered, he stops playing the charming businessman and starts showing the predator he really is. The call came early the next morning. Elena's phone rang, and I could see her face drain of color before she even spoke. The prosecutor's office was on the line. Natalia, the woman who had barely found the courage to share her story, had been attacked outside her home just hours earlier. She'd been walking down a quiet street when a masked man rushed her, knocked her to the ground, tried to silence her the old-fashioned way. She fought back. She screamed so loud that neighbors came running, and the attacker fled before he could finish what he started. Natalia never saw his face, couldn't say for certain who it was, but the timing was too sharp to ignore. She had only just agreed to testify against Nathan, and suddenly she's lying in the dirt, bruised and shaken, with a shadow of death still clinging to her. That wasn't chance, that was a message. The police moved quickly, placing her under protection, relocating her to a safe house, surrounding her with guards who understood the stakes. But even with that shield around her, I couldn't shake the dread crawling under my skin. Nathan wasn't just fighting the case in court anymore. He was reaching beyond it, trying to cut away every voice that could expose him. And if he could reach Natalia, what would stop him from coming after me, even under the watch of my ankle monitor? Igor's confession spilled out like poison he had carried for years, half choked, half whispered, as if saying the words aloud could bring Nathan crashing through the door. He admitted he had always known the truth, that his brother never married for love, only for profit, that each ceremony was a prelude to another staged accident. He swore he had never laid a hand on those women himself, never mixed the powders, never pushed them toward death, but he helped in other ways, arranging alibis, smoothing over paperwork, covering the cracks Nathan left behind. Every time he told himself it wasn't his crime, that he was only protecting family, but the guilt clung to him like smoke. When Elena asked why he was speaking now, his answer was simple and terrifying. Nathan had changed. The careful mask, the polished charm, the control that once made him untouchable were cracking, and beneath them there was something wild, dangerous, and unpredictable. He had begun to lash out even at Igor, threatening not just him but his wife and children, muttering that loose ends had to be tied. Igor's hands shook as he admitted he believed his brother would kill him next, erase him like all the others who knew too much. He described that night on the hostel roof, his voice breaking as he recalled the weight of the gun in his hand, Nathan's order echoing in his head. He had been told to kill me, to stage it as a desperate suicide, a tragic end for the so-called Black Widow. But when the moment came, he couldn't do it. He pulled his punches, swung wide on purpose, let me slip through his grip because, in his words, he could not become the monster his brother already was. I remembered the rage in his eyes that night, the bruising pain of his hand on my ankle, and for the first time I realized it had been hesitation, not bloodlust, that saved me. Now he was begging for protection, his voice raw, stripped of all pride. He promised to testify, to lay bare everything he had seen and done, if only the prosecutors would shield his family from Nathan's reach. Elena explained calmly that full immunity was impossible, that complicity could not be erased, but cooperation might save him from prison and, more importantly, from his brother's wrath. He nodded quickly, desperate, ready to cling to any lifeline. For the first time, the scales of power felt as if they might tip, not because Nathan weakened, but because the people around him were finally willing to step out of his shadow. His voice shook as he admitted that from the very beginning, Nathan had treated marriage like a business venture, each wife another contract, another payout, another calculated step toward a fortune built on graves. Igor swore he had never poured the poison, never touched the women, but he had been there in the background, covering for Nathan, arranging convenient alibis, smoothing out paperwork so no one would ever ask the right questions. Each time he told himself it wasn't his crime, that loyalty to family excused his silence, but the guilt gnawed at him, and now, with Nathan's rage turning inward, it was consuming him whole. He said Nathan was different these days, the perfect mask cracking, the charm slipping into snarls, the calm precision giving way to reckless threats. He had begun to speak openly of tying up loose ends, of silencing anyone who might betray him, even his own brother. Igor's hands shook as he whispered that Nathan had promised to make his death look like an accident, just as he had done so many times before. The fear in his eyes was real, raw, the fear of a man who knew exactly what his brother was capable of because he had helped hide it. When he spoke of the night on the hostel roof, I felt my throat tighten, every bruise on my body burning anew. He admitted Nathan had ordered him to kill me, to stage it as a suicide, to finish the story before it could reach the light of day. He had raised the gun, had chased me through the shadows, had nearly dragged me over the edge, but in the final moment he faltered, not because of mercy, he said, but because he couldn't let himself become the same kind of monster. His hesitation had saved me, though I still felt no gratitude, only the chill of realizing how close I had come to disappearing forever. Now he begged for protection, his words spilling out like a plea for absolution. He promised to tell the prosecutors everything: names, dates, the forged alibis, the nights he had helped Nathan bury the truth. If only they would shield his wife and children from retaliation. Elena kept her composure, explaining that full immunity was impossible, that complicity carried a price. But his cooperation could lighten the weight of punishment and keep his family safe. I sat in silence, my heart pounding, watching the brother of my would-be murderer unravel before me, and for the first time I felt the balance of power begin to shift, not through victory, but through betrayal from within. Igor was still guilty, but the prosecutors told him that if he cooperated, it would count in his favor when the time came. He agreed. He signed a full statement, describing everything he knew about Nathan's crimes: the dead wives, the life insurance money, the so-called accidents, the poison in my glass, and the plan to silence me after I ran from the restaurant. His words were the final nail in Nathan's coffin. Now the prosecutors had 3 witnesses: Andrei, Natalia, and Igor. 3 voices, all pointing to the same truth. Nathan was a serial killer, and I was meant to be his next victim. The very next day, an arrest warrant was issued. Police went to his house, ready to take him in. But Nathan was gone. He had vanished. He must have felt the walls closing in and slipped away before they could reach him. The city went on high alert. Police checked airports, train stations, highways. They sent out bulletins and put his name on the federal wanted list. But it was like he had disappeared into thin air. Elena was furious. She blamed the prosecutors for moving too slowly, for giving him the chance to run. And I sat there, knowing he was out there somewhere, free and more dangerous than ever. I blamed the police for their incompetence, because if they had arrested Nathan the moment Igor gave his statement, he never would have had the chance to disappear. I felt crushed by the thought that after everything we had done, after all the evidence we had managed to gather, Nathan could still slip away from justice, vanish into another country, and start over with a new life, a new victim, and the same dark pattern repeating again. For 3 endless days I lived in that fear, counting the hours, imagining the worst, until the unexpected happened and turned the ground under my feet. The call came from Elena, the only voice allowed to reach me through the landline in my apartment, since every other connection to the outside world was cut by the rules of my house arrest. She sounded shaken, her words stumbling over each other, her tone urgent and raw. Nathan had reached out, not to the police, not to the prosecutors, but directly to me, as if the entire chase, the entire investigation, meant nothing to him. He had sent a letter, an ordinary envelope slipped into my mailbox. No return address, no fingerprints that we could hope for, just a few words scratched on a sheet of paper that smelled faintly of his cologne. I know what you did. I know who is helping you. Meet me where it all began, tomorrow, 8 p.m. Just you and me, or your new friends will regret crossing me. My hands shook as I read it, each line dripping with menace, each word dragging me back into the nightmare I thought I had escaped. It was more than a warning. It was a clear threat, not only to me but to everyone who dared to stand beside me. He named no one, but I could see their faces in my mind. Andrei, trembling but brave, Natalia, who risked everything by breaking her silence, and Elena, who had fought for me when no one else would. Nathan's words meant only one thing. He was still in control, and he wanted me to know that he could strike at any of us whenever he chose. Elena sent the letter straight to the police, and they immediately began planning an operation to finally bring Nathan down. Where it all began could only mean the restaurant, the same place where he had tried to poison me on our wedding night. Their idea was to surround the building, set up snipers on the rooftops, and send in a tactical team ready to strike at the first sign of trouble. On paper, it sounded airtight, but there was one catch. Nathan's note had been clear. just you and me. He demanded a private meeting, no witnesses, no shadows in the corners. He wanted me alone, the same way he had wanted me that night when he slipped poison into my glass. This time, he meant to finish what he started. The police tried to come up with alternatives, even suggested sending in a female officer dressed like me, someone who could pass for me from a distance. But Nathan knew me too well. He had studied every look, every habit, every detail. One wrong move, one hesitation, and he would see through the disguise. Then he would vanish again, deeper into the shadows, maybe forever, and we would lose the only chance to catch him. I couldn't let that happen. So I suggested a different plan, one that made Elena's face tighten with fury. I told them I would go myself. I would wear a hidden earpiece and a wire, so every word would be recorded, every sound transmitted to the team waiting nearby. They could be close enough to intervene the second things turned violent. My task would be to hold him there, to make him talk, to push him into revealing the truth with his own mouth. If I could capture his confession, no amount of money or influence would save him. Elena was horrified. She said it was too dangerous, that Nathan was cornered now, and a cornered predator was always the most unpredictable, the most vicious. She begged me not to risk it, but I had already made up my mind. After everything he had done to me, after everything he had taken from me and the women before me, I couldn't let fear stop me anymore. This was my fight, and it had to end where it began. He could have done anything, and deep down I knew it, but I kept insisting. This was our only real chance to corner him, our only chance to get hard evidence that no one could deny, our only chance to end this nightmare once and for all. In the end, the police gave in, though not without their conditions. The restaurant would be completely surrounded, undercover officers would already be inside pretending to be guests, and I would be wearing a bulletproof vest hidden under my clothes. I'd be wired, with an earpiece to hear their instructions and a microphone to capture every word. At the first sign of danger, they promised they would move in. There was still one major problem: my house arrest. I couldn't legally leave my apartment, not even for this. Elena filed an emergency petition with the judge, laying out the situation in full detail. By some miracle, the judge agreed. Just one evening, just this one time, only to participate in the operation against a dangerous fugitive. It was the only way. The entire next day was spent in preparation. Police technicians filled my apartment, checking the wire, testing the earpiece, drilling me on what to say, what not to say, and how to stall for time. Elena never left my side, her presence both steady and protective, though I could see the fear in her eyes no matter how much she tried to hide it. She knew the risk I was walking into. We both did. When it was finally time, I dressed carefully. A simple black dress and low-heeled shoes, practical if I had to run. The bulletproof vest pressed against my ribs, thin but heavy, invisible under the fabric. The earpiece sat snug in my ear, the tiny mic disguised as a brooch on my chest. By the time an unmarked police car pulled up outside to take me to the restaurant, my heart was hammering so hard I thought it might give me away before I even got there. They dropped me off a block away from the restaurant so Nathan wouldn't see me arriving with police. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I walked those last few steps, the night air heavy around me. My heart pounded so hard I thought people passing on the street could hear it, and my hands shook despite the effort to keep them still. But I wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when we were so close to ending this nightmare. Inside, everything looked the same. The soft lights, the polished tables, the quiet hum of music. But the air was different. The romance was gone, replaced by something sharp and menacing, like the whole room held its breath. The maitre d' greeted me at the door, and when I gave Nathan's name, he nodded knowingly, as if he'd been expecting me all along. He led me across the dining room, past couples who had no idea what was happening just a few feet away, to the table tucked in the far corner, the same table where my life had shattered. Nathan was already there, waiting. My husband, the man who had tried to kill me, the man who had killed others before me, the man I had once loved. His appearance had changed. He looked thinner, unshaven, with red-rimmed eyes. but he still carried that dangerous elegance in his expensive suit, that aura of control that used to draw me in and now only made my stomach turn. He smiled when he saw me, that same practiced smile that once made me weak. Now it made me sick. "You came," he said, his voice carrying a hint of surprise, maybe even grudging respect. "I wasn't sure you'd have the nerve." I sat across from him, keeping my back straight, forcing my face into calmness even though fear pulsed through every nerve. In my earpiece, a quiet voice reminded me, "We hear you. Stay calm, everything's on track." Nathan lifted a glass of wine with mocking charm, offering it to me like it was a private joke. I shook my head, refusing, and his smirk told me he got the message. Then the real conversation began. I started slow, steering him toward the truth, asking about his past wives, the insurance money, the plan he had for me. He dodged, slippery as ever, his words carefully chosen, leaving no hooks for the law to catch. But the longer we spoke, the more his patience cracked. His answers grew sharp, angry. He accused me of betrayal, of ruining the life he had built, the future that was supposed to be his. His voice darkened as he spoke of how simple everything would have been if I had just drunk that wine like I was supposed to. My questions pushed deeper, my tone steady, and little by little I saw the mask slip. His polished calm gave way to raw irritation, and with it came the words we needed, the pieces of truth he'd fought so hard to keep hidden. He started talking about how he chose his wives, always wealthy, always isolated, always vulnerable, how he planned their deaths so carefully, making them look like accidents, crafting perfect alibis for himself every single time, how he collected the insurance money afterward and savored the thrill of getting away with it. I sat there listening, and inside me a storm of fear and fury boiled over. This wasn't just a cruel man. He was a predator who had murdered 3 women, tried to murder a 4th, and then set his sights on me. And the way he spoke, so casual, so calm, like he was discussing the weather or the price of wine, it made me sick. At some point he noticed the shift in my face, the anger I couldn't mask anymore. He stopped, narrowed his eyes, and studied me with a sharp, knowing look. "You're recording this," he said, not as a question, but as a fact. "You're working with the police." I didn't bother to deny it. There was no point. He could see the truth in me, just as I could see the monster in him. Nathan glanced around the room, his gaze sharp, hunting for hidden cops, hidden wires, hidden cameras. His expression changed, his smile gone, his jaw tight, his eyes hard. He looked like a cornered animal, dangerous and unpredictable. My heart slammed in my chest, and in my ear I heard the officer's calm voice, "Stay steady. We're ready to move." Nathan leaned forward across the table, lowering his voice until it was nearly a hiss. He asked if I really thought I could trap him so easily. He told me he had connections, money, influence, that even if they arrested him tonight, by tomorrow he'd be free again. I told him this time it was different, that we had witnesses, Andre, Natalia, his own brother, Igor, that prosecutors were already moving on exhumations of his former wives, already building the case that exposed his entire pattern of crimes. He laughed then, a cold, empty laugh that carried no humor at all. He said witnesses could disappear, evidence could vanish, his brother could change his story, and I didn't have the faintest idea of what he was capable of doing to protect himself. I stared into his eyes and saw nothing there but a void, a bottomless, icy void where a soul should have been, a man without conscience, without morality, without humanity. But I wasn't afraid of him anymore, not of that emptiness, not of that coldness, because now I finally knew who he really was. I knew his weaknesses, his fears, and the cracks in the armor he thought was unbreakable. I asked him why he chose me. Out of all the women in the world, why was I the one he decided to make his target? Was it random, or was there something about me that stood out? He smiled then, that same smile that once seemed warm and genuine, the smile that had made me believe he loved me. But now I saw it clearly for what it was, pure calculation, pure manipulation. He said I had been perfect, Alone, financially stable, with a good job and my own apartment. No close family except for a mother with mental health struggles, a history of depression that made me vulnerable, easy to discredit, and of course, attractive enough that he could play the role of the doting husband without raising suspicion. Every word felt like a knife twisting inside me, but I refused to let him see my pain. I kept my voice calm, steady, and kept asking questions, forcing him to talk, forcing him to reveal himself. I asked about his other wives, and he answered with chilling pride, like a craftsman admiring his own work. Elena, he had loosened the brakes on her car before their trip into the mountains, then stepped out to take photos so he wouldn't be inside when it went over the cliff. Anna, he slipped sleeping pills into her wine and gave her the smallest push when she leaned over the balcony rail. Afterward, he staged it so it looked like she'd been trying to catch a falling flower pot. Irina, he laced her cocktail with something that triggered violent seizures in the water, then dove in after her, pretending to be the grieving husband who just couldn't save her in time. And me, I was supposed to be the biggest payout yet, 5 million, a rare poison, nearly undetectable in standard tests. His plan was perfect, he said, because he would take a small dose himself, just enough to look like a victim too. Perfect, except for one thing. The waiter who ruined everything with one whispered warning. As he spoke, I watched the mask start to crack. The cool, confident man I once thought I knew was unraveling in front of me. His voice grew softer, less steady. His eyes darted to the corners of the room, as if shadows were watching. He began to stammer, realizing he was trapped, realizing his words were being captured, realizing that the police might already be closing in. So I asked him about Marina, my former best friend, the money he'd been sending her, what her part in all of this had been. Nathan smirked when I brought up Marina. He said she had been the easiest part of his plan. She fell for him almost instantly, he bragged, and she was willing to do anything to be with him, even betray her best friend, even become an accomplice to murder. He used her to gather everything he needed about me, my habits, my fears, my finances, my weaknesses, every little detail that helped him slide perfectly into my life as the man of my dreams. And when the plan was in motion, when we were married, when the insurance was signed, Marina's role was simple. She would be his alibi. She'd back up his story about my instability, about my supposed obsessions, about how I was falling apart. I asked him if he ever loved her. He laughed. He said he never loved anyone, not her, not me, not any of the others. Love, he said, was just a weakness he exploited in people, but never allowed in himself. By now, I could see him starting to fray. His arrogance was slipping, replaced by nerves. He realized he had said too much, that every word, every smug confession was being recorded. He shifted his tone, his voice softer now, almost pleading. He tried to call back memories, the dinners, the smiles, the moments when I had believed we were happy. He told me we could still run away together, leave the country, start over, pretend none of this ever happened. I just stared at him, stunned that I had ever believed a word he said, that I had once imagined spending my life with him. All I felt now was exhaustion, disgust. I told him it was over, that there was no way back, that he would answer for everything he had done, to me and to the women before me. That was when his mask shattered. His face twisted, his eyes narrowed to slits. He leaned in close, hissing that if he went down, he'd take me with him, that even behind bars, he'd find a way to destroy me, that he would make sure my life became hell. I didn't flinch, I didn't look away. I let him see the contempt in my eyes, the resolve in my face, and that's when it happened. He broke, really broke. His composure vanished, panic flooding his expression. His eyes darted wildly around the restaurant like a cornered animal. Then, suddenly, he shot up from his chair, knocking over his wine glass in the process. The red wine bled across the white tablecloth, a chilling echo of our wedding night, a reminder of where it had all begun. Nathan moved toward the exit, but froze when 2 men rose from their seats at the bar, plainclothes officers. He spun to the other side, only to find more men standing, blocking the way. The walls were closing in. He was cornered, caged, with nowhere to run. His eyes locked on mine, and for the first time, I saw something new. Rage, yes. Hatred, of course, but also fear. And beneath it, a glimmer of respect. He had underestimated me. He hadn't thought I'd be able to outplay him. He hadn't expected the victim to turn into the hunter. The officers moved closer, one stepping forward to show his badge, his voice steady and calm. He announced Nathan's arrest on charges of attempted murder and the murders of 3 women. Nathan didn't resist. He let them cuff his hands, let them read his rights, but his eyes never left mine. They burned into me, filled with venom, with promises of revenge. As they pulled him away, he turned one last time, his voice low and cold, meant only for me. "This isn't over, Varvara. I'll find a way to reach you, even from prison." His words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I stayed frozen in my chair, staring at the spilled wine staining the white cloth, at the 2 glasses, one empty, one still full. Symbols of our twisted story, of everything we had lived and lost. Elena came to my side, her hand warm and grounding on my shoulder. She asked softly if I was all right. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with too many emotions. She reminded me that this was only the beginning. There would be statements, trials, witnesses, maybe even more threats. But she also told me that the worst was behind me. Nathan was in custody, his crimes laid bare. He could hurt no one else. I stood, feeling strangely hollow. No relief, no victory, no joy. Just emptiness, as though with Nathan's arrest, a part of me had been stripped away. The part that once loved him, trusted him, dreamed of a life with him. Before leaving, I did what I had promised myself I would. I picked up both glasses, the one Nathan had drunk from and the one meant for me, and smashed them against the floor. The sharp crash of breaking glass echoed through the silent restaurant, a final act of closure in the place where it had all begun. Would you like me to carry the story straight into the courtroom scenes, the trial, Marina's fate, and the ultimate verdict? Or should I slow it down and show the quieter days leading up to trial? The shards glittered across the marble floor, catching the dim light like shards of ice. Drops of wine splattered crimson against the pale stone, as if the room itself bled with the truth finally exposed. It was my exorcism, my way of ending the nightmare, of saying, enough. I turned my back on the wreckage and walked out of the restaurant without a single glance behind me. The cool night air brushed my skin, but inside I felt a quiet warmth, fragile, tentative, not happiness exactly, but something that resembled hope. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to imagine a beginning rather than an ending. Elena was waiting by her car, her face softening into a smile the moment she saw me. She held the door open, steady as always, and I slid into the seat, buckling in as though anchoring myself in this new reality. We drove through the city streets, headlights painting ribbons of light on the asphalt. I watched the blur of ordinary lives rushing by, the laughter spilling from a cafe, couples crossing the street arm in arm, a man carrying groceries home, and I felt the sting of longing. That used to be my life, a life that now felt impossibly far away, yet still something I dreamed of reclaiming. Only I knew I would never be the same. Pain had changed me. Survival had shaped me. I had learned to see people not through the masks they wore, but through the shadows in their eyes. At the prosecutor's office, the same investigator who once branded me guilty now greeted me with quiet respect. His voice was calm, almost apologetic, as he guided us to his office and poured steaming cups of tea. He said the night would be long, hours of testimony, questions, signatures, but beneath his professional tone was reassurance. The net around Nathan was finally tight enough. His arrogant confessions at the restaurant, his detailed descriptions of past murders, his threats, his rage, all of it was recorded, undeniable, ready to be presented before a court. Then he delivered the news that nearly stole my breath. Marina had been arrested. My so-called best friend, my confidant, my sister in everything but blood, had folded almost immediately under questioning. She confessed to her role, feeding Nathan details about my life, reinforcing the image of me as unstable, ready to collapse. She had handed him the tools he needed to destroy me, and now, faced with prison herself, she was turning against him in a desperate bid for mercy. I listened to it all without anger, without grief, without even surprise. Marina no longer existed as the friend I once loved. She was nothing more than a stranger to me now, a traitor, an accomplice, a hollow soul who had sold me for her obsession with a killer. The investigator kept talking, his voice steady, almost clinical, as if listing facts from a file. He explained that the exhumation of Nathan's previous wives had already begun, and the first toxicology results confirmed what we had suspected all along. Poison in every case. 3 women, 3 so-called accidents, 3 carefully staged murders. The lies unraveled into hard evidence, each discovery tying the noose tighter around Nathan's neck. The prosecutor was preparing to charge him not only with attempted murder but with serial homicide, the kind of case that would never end with a light sentence. A lifetime behind bars, that was the future waiting for him now. I nodded when asked, answered their questions, signed the endless stack of papers. But inside, I felt nothing but exhaustion, a crushing, bone-deep weariness that wrapped itself around me like chains. It wasn't relief, not yet. It wasn't joy or triumph either, just fatigue from carrying fear and rage for so long. By the time the formalities were finished, I felt hollow, like I had been wrung dry. Elena drove me back to my old apartment, the place I had lived before Nathan, before my life had been torn apart. It was where I would have to start over. We said goodbye at the entrance. She hugged me, awkward but sincere, and whispered that time heals, that I was strong enough to get through this, that I would make it. Her faith in me felt like a lifeline. I went upstairs, closed the door behind me, and turned the key in the lock. The click of that lock was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Safety, control. My life was finally mine again. I walked into the living room, sat on the couch, and let my eyes wander across the familiar space. My home, my things, my life before Nathan, my life after him. On the table stood a photo frame, me and Marina smiling with our arms wrapped around each other, taken on my birthday 2 years ago. Before Nathan, before betrayal, before the collapse of a friendship I thought would last forever. I picked up the picture, stared at it for a long time, and then tore it into pieces, each rip sharp and final. I dropped the fragments into the trash. Another chapter closed, another bond severed. I went to the window and looked out at the city lights, the stars, the moon. The world kept moving, indifferent to my pain, my losses, my survival, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt something close to peace. Not happiness, not yet, but calm. Confidence that the worst was finally behind me, that I had survived, endured, fought back. I turned off the lights and lay down on the couch without even undressing. My eyes closed easily this time. No shadows, no nightmares, no images of Nathan chasing me through the dark. I simply drifted into sleep, and in the morning, it was the phone that pulled me back to reality. The ringtone echoed in the quiet apartment. When I answered, it was my mother's voice on the other end. She was crying, her words tumbling out in gasps, begging me to forgive her for not believing me. She said she had seen the news, that now she knew the truth about Nathan, about his crimes, about his arrest. I sat there listening, and inside me 2 feelings collided: relief that she finally believed me, and bitterness that it had taken a television broadcast to convince her when my own words weren't enough. But I didn't scold her, didn't remind her of how she had turned away when I needed her most. I simply told her it was okay, that I understood, that we could talk later when she had calmed down. After hanging up, I turned on the TV, only to see my own face on the screen. My story, my fight, my survival. The anchors spoke about the sensational arrest of a serial killer, about the woman who had helped bring him down, about the shocking confession caught on tape. They showed Nathan in handcuffs, head bowed, surrounded by police. They showed Marina, crying, broken, afraid. They showed Elena, confident and professional, speaking to reporters. And they showed me, walking out of the restaurant after Nathan's arrest, calm, steady, head held high. Not a victim, but a survivor, a fighter. I switched it off. I didn't want to hear another word, didn't want to see his face or hers. I just wanted silence. I wanted my life back. I showered, dressed in fresh clothes, and for the first time in days I felt clean, not just on my skin, but in my soul. It was as if the steam and water had washed away the last traces of Nathan's touch, his lies, his poison. Then I sat at my kitchen table and began to write. Not a diary, not a confession, a plan for a new life. What I wanted to do, where I wanted to go, who I wanted to become now that the nightmare was finally ending. I decided I would leave my job. Too many coworkers knew too much, and I couldn't bear the whispers, the pitying looks. I would sell the apartment. Too many ghosts lived there with me. I would start over in a new city, with new people, a new name if I had to. But before I could begin again, I had to finish what was already in motion. Nathan's trial, the testimony, the cross-examinations, the final confrontation where justice would no longer be a hope, but a verdict. The months ahead would be filled with endless hearings, motions, and cross-examinations, maybe even years before I could truly close this chapter of my life. But I was ready to fight until the very end, to make sure Nathan paid the highest price for his crimes, to make sure he never again had the chance to hurt another woman. A week after his arrest, the first court session was scheduled, just a preliminary hearing to confirm that he would remain in custody. I sat in the front row, my hands clenched in my lap, my eyes locked on him the moment he entered the courtroom. He looked different now, thinner, pale, his face lined with exhaustion. Instead of the sharp suit and polished shoes, he wore a prison uniform, chains clinking at his wrists. Yet in his eyes I still saw that same coldness, that same calculating arrogance, the same belief that he was smarter than everyone else in the room. When our gazes met, he forced a smile. The very smile that once felt warm to me, comforting, disarming. Now it only filled me with disgust. The judge listened to the arguments and then gave the ruling. Nathan would stay behind bars until trial, no bail, no release. The charges were too serious, the risk of escape too great, and the evidence against him too overwhelming. As the guards let him out, he turned his head and looked at me one last time. And in that moment, I saw something new in his expression. Fear. Real, unfiltered fear. For the first time, he seemed to understand that his game was over, that the mask had slipped for good, that he was staring at the rest of his life behind prison walls. That was the moment I felt my final chain break. I realized I no longer feared him, no longer felt trapped by his power. I had survived, I had fought back, and I had won. Walking out of the courthouse, I lifted my head and drew in a long breath of fresh air. The sky seemed brighter, the sounds of the city sharper, the people around me more alive. For the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled. Not because I was happy, not yet, but because I was free. Free to start over, free to rebuild, free to step into a life without Nathan, without his lies, without his shadow. I realized I was stronger than I ever thought. I survived where others had fallen, I fought back where others had been silenced, and I won where others had lost. That knowledge gave me the strength to keep moving forward, step by step, day by day, toward a new life, a new self, a new future. A future where Nathan would be nothing more than a dark chapter in my past. A chapter I had turned and left behind. A chapter that made me wiser, sharper, stronger, that taught me the most important lesson of all: never to trust blindly, never to hand over my life, my safety, my happiness into someone else's hands, never to let sweet words and promises cloud my mind. And another lesson too, never to give up. Not when the world is against you, not when no one believes you, not even when it feels like there's no way out. There is always a way forward. There is always a way to win. There is always hope. And I am walking that path now, one step at a time, one day at a time, toward a new life, a new self, a new beginning. Without Nathan, without his shadow, without his power over me. I know one day I'll look back and see it all as a distant nightmare, a story that shaped me, a chapter I turned and left behind. But for now I keep moving forward, toward the sun, toward the light, toward freedom, toward a life that is only just beginning. Friends, if this story touched you, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helped me keep going. Leave a comment below, tell me what you felt while listening. And of course, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Believe me, they're just as powerful and unforgettable. Your support means everything to me.